So without further ado, the theme for this panel is non-canonical political actants and their influence on the mainstream. Chair for the panel is Professor MacLean, a historian of South Asia, specializing in the experience of colonialism in North India, with an interest in political communication in colonial India. She was trained in the School of Politics at La Trobe University in late 1990s and completed a PhD on the history and politics of the Kumbh Mela in 2003. The resulting book, Pilgrimage and Power, the Kumbh Mela in Allahabad, New York, is published by the OUP, Oxford University Press from New York in 2008. She was awarded an honorable mention in the AAS's Kumaraswamy Book Prize in 2009. Professor MacLean's second book, A Revolutionary History of Interwar India, Violence, Image, Voice and Text, was published by OUP as well in 2015. It demonstrated that the oft-averred dominance of Gandhian nonviolence in the historiography of the nationalist movement is not borne out by a close examination of a range of oral, material, and visual culture sources. Our discussant for the day, Dr. Ishan Mukherjee, teaches history and politics at OP Jindal Global University in India. He has a PhD in history from Trinity College, University of Cambridge, and is interested in questions of state-making and violence in South Asia during the transition from the colonial to the post-colonial period. He has been a fellow of the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, New York. He also writes commentaries on contemporary Indian politics. So over to you, Professor MacLean.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Rohit. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to see such exciting scholarship coming up on areas that have been neglected for a very long time. So our first speaker is Kerkar Devika Arun, who is a third-year PhD student at the Centre for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal University. Her PhD dissertation is a biography of J.B. Kripalani, and she'll be speaking about this today in her presentation, Revisiting J.B. Kripalani, a study of his speeches and writings. Please, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Professor MacLean, for the introduction, and good evening, everybody. I would like to begin my paper by quoting the historian Rudrangshu Mukherjee, who argued in 2001, and I quote, "Biography is not an art that flourishes in India despite the nation's obsession with individuals." Now, 2 decades later, at least from afar, it might seem that things have begun to change, especially with regard to biographies of political leaders. However, as Vinay Sitapati states, this nascent political revival is anchored in ideological waters. The resultant, not all leaders have enjoyed strong posthumous recognition. On the contrary, in case of some leaders, their current marginal presence is at complete variance with the powerful positions they once occupied. Among the most prominent of these prominent obscure leaders is the subject of my paper, J.B. Kripalani, who now finds a place of honor in history textbooks and long forgotten out-of-print books. Despite being the president of the Congress during independence and partition, Kripalani does not figure prominently in books on the subject and has been allowed a cameo in the biographies of his more famous friends and foes. The most unfortunate testimony to Kripalani's marginal presence in history can be gauged from the fact that his autobiography was published in 2004, that is 26 years after his death in 1982. Similarly, it is not uncommon to find glaring erroneous references to Kripalani's life events, such as his birth date or even the year of his death. Now, among all prominent figures of 20th century modern Indian history, Kripalani is certainly one who cannot be easily slotted into any category. Take the case of his regional identity. Born in 1888 in Hyderabad, Sindh, Kripalani left his home province at an early age. This paved the way for a peripatetic career, making Kripalani an all-India figure in the truest sense. Thus, in his autobiography, Gandhi described Kripalani, and I quote, "Though a Sindhi, he was more Bihari than a born Bihari. I've seen few workers capable of merging themselves in the province of their adoption. Kripalani is one of those. He made it impossible for anyone to feel that he belonged to a different province." Thereafter, Kripalani worked in Allahabad in the United Provinces. Therefore, the British were confused as to where he belonged when it was decided that the Congress Working Committee members were to be transferred to prisons in their home provinces. After independence, Kripalani was primarily based in New Delhi, while constituents in Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and Madhya Pradesh sent him to the parliament as their representative. Likewise, Kripalani is an interesting figure because, to quote Ramchandra Guha, his views are hard to pinpoint in ideological terms. Over the years, Kripalani's name has been associated with various ideological strands. Among these, it is Gandhism that holds sway, with Kripalani being referred to as Gandhi's staunchest followers, Gandhi's aide, and even the Saint Paul of Gandhism. He has also been described as a socialist, an anti-communist, ex-socialist, progressive, and different people have placed him within the left wing and right wing within the Congress, respectively. On the eve of partition and thereafter, Kripalani was accused of being an anti-Muslim and inciting violence against them. Apart from ideology, Kripalani has also been described on the basis of the relationship he shared with other leaders. For instance, along with Gandhi's aide, he was referred to as one of Nehru's gadflies and Krishna Menon's betanoy. Through my paper, I wish to revisit various phases in Kripalani's life in order to ask the question, who was J.B. Kripalani, especially with regard to his ideological leanings? It is hardly surprising that Kripalani is often referred to as Gandhian. That was because he was the first associate of Gandhi to meet him when he returned to India and took to promoting Khadi actively along with Gandhi's Nai Talim. Kripalani was also a known exponent of Gandhian thought, and through his writing, he tried, and I quote, to defend his ideas as far as I could against attack from the advocates of constitutional agitation when India had no democratic constitution by which the government could be changed. I also had to defend his ideas against the so-called scientific socialists who held that freedom and socialism could be achieved in India simultaneously. I had to explain to the skeptics the value of the constructive program and scientific nature of Gandhi's basic education. Kripalani also preferred Gandhi's way of looking at social and political problems, or the Gandhian way, over Gandhism, for in his views, all isms, and I quote, come into existence not at the initiative of those in whose names they are preached and promulgated, but as a result of limitations imposed upon the original idea by his followers. In his opinions, followers deprived the original doctrine of its freshness and flexibility and made it rigid, inelastic, one-sided, and fanatical. It is ironic that in 1946, Kripalani's writings on Gandhi were seen as anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim. Also, following his election as the Congress president, Kripalani was called a communalist. This was with regard to his statements on Noakhali and due to his visit to Sindh in 1947. However, these allegations fail to take into account Kripalani's statement as Congress president, and I quote, my first task I conceived then is to exert my uttermost in the cause of Hindu-Muslim unity so that the inhumanities and barbarities that recently disfigured and disgraced Calcutta and still do East Bengal become things of the past. It is also true that over the years, Kripalani emerged as one of Nehru's biggest gadflies. This was particularly the case after independence, after Kripalani resigned from the Congress and joined the opposition ranks with the formation of the Kisan Mazdoor Praja Party, or the KMPP, which later merged with the Socialist Party to form the Praja Socialist Party, or the PSP. It is the membership of the latter which has often led to Kripalani being referred to as a socialist. On surface, he was certainly one, and even represented the PSP at the 5th Congress of the Socialist International held in Vienna. However, Kripalani and the Socialist Party members were not on cordial terms right from before independence time. The PSP itself had been formed after overcoming a number of roadblocks, most prominent among which was Kripalani himself. The issue here was ideological, particularly Kripalani's opposition to Marxism, as admitted by Acharya Narendra Deva to Ashoka Mehta in the following letter, and I quote, Professor Mukut Bihari Lal is very much against the merger and is thinking of leaving the party. Acharya Kripalani's latest statement has completely upset him. I'm afraid he may come out with a counter statement. It is wrong to start an ideological controversy at this stage. The merger is based on identity of program and policy and not that of ideology. I have not ceased to be a Marxist by agreeing to the merger, and if I have to abjure Marxism, I would rather leave the new party than be in it. Kripalani's relationship with the PSP itself was fraught with difficulties. His friend P.D. Chittaranjan claimed Kripalani was not the party boss in PSP, and I quote him, he's only there to guide him in times of difficulty, and his name lends prestige to the party. In 1954, Kripalani had submitted his resignation as the chairperson of the party and left the party itself in 1960. His difficult relationship with the party was evident in his resignation letter, where he wrote, and I quote, not a soul in our party ever visited my constituency. I did want help and asked for it, but none was forthcoming. Not that there was no opposition. In Bihar, caste opposition is not to be despised. I don't write this to complain, but to indicate that in the party I've had to plow a lonely furrow. Within the parliament itself, Kripalani was one of the biggest critics of Krishna Menon, particularly after he became the defense minister. To quote Kripalani, whenever there was a discussion in parliament about the defense ministry, I highlighted its effective functioning under Menon. Thus, for instance, on 11th April 1961, Kripalani sarcastically remarked that Menon had presented very eloquently a very encouraging picture of the might of our military forces, and what has been done under his stewardship. It is perhaps therefore that we've lost 12,000 square miles of our territory without striking a single blow. Outside the parliament, the two fought a bitter electoral battle in 1962 in the North Bombay constituency. Throughout the campaign, Kripalani accused Menon of being a fellow traveller, and a pamphlet released by his campaign team read, and I quote, "If Menon is not pro-communist, one wonders why the communists of India are pro-Menon. The communists never criticize him or his department in the Lok Sabha, whereas they criticize all ministers, including the Prime Minister. They have publicly declared to their party secretary that they will support Menon, even though he is a Congress candidate." Apart from criticizing the Indian government, particularly the Defence Minister, as a chairperson of the Central Relief Committee for Tibetan Refugees, Kripalani was associated with the relief and rehabilitation of Tibetans in India. This in turn led him to work closely with the American Emergency Committee for Tibetan Refugees, which was the brainchild of Marvin Libman, a noted anti-communist. Therefore, it is hardly surprising that during the heights of Cuban Missile Crisis, Kripalani openly declared, and I quote, "I tell you, the greatest service that Kennedy and America have done is this affair of Cuba. Remember, these communists are bluffers and bullies, and he called their bluff. He has done a great service to humanity." Away from all the epithets, Kripalani's own ideas were better reflected in the KMPP, particularly in his inaugural speech, for it revealed his vision for a democratic, united opposition in India. This vision would resonate throughout his career among the opposition ranks. For Kripalani, it was absolutely crucial to have an alternative, an opposition to the ruling party, because to deprive people of an alternative party in a democracy is to cripple them and make them helpless. Also, in forging such an alternative party or opposition party to government, there was no place for ideology, as ideological fights are unreal. They are fights about abstract terms which may mean anything or nothing. They are, moreover, fights of fanatical creeds that believe that those who are not with us are against us. He also criticized the usage of terms such as right and left in Indian politics by stating, and I quote, "We use the phrases coined in the West under different conditions and unthinkingly apply them to our own." Following his fallout with the PSP, on two occasions, Kripalani's electoral contest brought non-communist opposition parties together. The first was in the North Bombay election in 1962. In 1963 by-election, the non-communist opposition parties united in Amroha, Rajkot and Farrukhabad in support of Kripalani, Masani and Lohia. The trio emerged victorious, but questions regarding how far these victories would actually succeed in providing an alternative to Congress emerged. Kripalani himself was thinking on the same lines. Upon being invited to a socialist unity conference, Kripalani used the platform as an opportunity to lay down his minimum point program over which non-communist parties could unite. This program included the following. Number one, a clean and efficient administration. Number two, resistance to the Chinese aggression till every inch of Indian soil was vacated by the enemy. Number three, continuous efforts towards bringing about some kind of understanding between India and Pakistan. Number four, the establishment in India of social justice. Socialism was a vague term to which not all democratic parties might be able to subscribe. Number five, no further nationalization of industry and commerce till schemes already undertaken in public sector were consolidated and run at least as efficiently, if not as profitably as those in the private sector. Number six, effective control of enterprise in private sector. However, Kripalani's minimum point failed to find takers, particularly among the Socialists and the Swatantra Party. The other opposition leaders instead came together to move a no-confidence motion. After much deliberation, Kripalani was entrusted with the responsibility of moving the no-confidence motion. He framed his no-confidence motion in three simple words, and I quote, "This House expresses its want of confidence in the present Council of Ministers." This motion became the first one in the history of Lok Sabha to get minimum support and came up for discussion. The 1970s saw the opposition leaders unite under Jayaprakash Narayan, or JP, during the tenure of Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and JP himself launched a movement against the government, and Kripalani played a very important role in it through the Delhi Nagarik Sangharsh Samiti, of which he was the chairperson. After the imposition of emergency and the arrest of opposition leaders under the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, Kripalani was one of the few leaders who was not arrested. On his part, Kripalani continued to speak against emergency through his writings and even prophesied, and I quote, "If I have not read history in vain, I can say with confidence that as soon as the jail gates are opened, The detained leaders will get such a popular ovation that will leave their present detractors and maligners gaping in astonishment. But perhaps many of them will that day be found among the joyous and cheering crowds. Naturally, the formation and victory of the Janata Party in the 1977 elections was in many ways a dream come true for Kripalani. The constituents of the new party had gone beyond his expectations of minimum points, gone beyond ideology, and merged together to form a new party. In fact, Kripalani campaigned for the new party, and he and JP were instrumental in selecting Morarji Desai as the prime minister. But as the new party was greatly weakened by internal squabbles, both Kripalani and JP were concerned by this. On 16 March 1978, Kripalani announced his retirement after being active for 72 years in public life. However, he also made it clear that he was not taking sannyas and would not hesitate to jump into the fray as I did on the last occasion in case of freedom and honor were at stake. As the fortunes of the Janata Party dwindled following internal differences, Kripalani was increasingly called to resolve the deadlock. Thus, in keeping with the resolve to intervene in time of need, Kripalani once again found himself at the center of Indian politics, but the Janata Party government itself collapsed. Following the announcement of fresh elections, Kripalani was once again approached to be active in politics by way of campaign and support. This request was made by two influential members of the Janata Party, Ram Jethmalani and Vijay Raje Scindia. In fact, Jethmalani even reached out to the party supremo, Chandrasekhar, and reminded him, and I quote, that there still exists a center of moral force who has been so far ignored and yet who could greatly assist our election campaign. I'm referring to Acharya Kripalani ji. May I suggest that you and other leaders should immediately call upon him and persuade him to bless our campaign and to participate in it to utmost limit of his physical capacity. In response, Kripalani expressed his disillusion with the prevailing politics and citing his own ill health and advanced age refused to be involved in canvassing. I would like to conclude by quoting the former governor of Karnataka, the late T.N. Chaturvedi, who in my opinion summed up Kripalani's life in the most apt manner, and I quote, "The life of Jivatram Bhagwandas Kripalani, congressman, Gandhian, socialist, parliamentarian and writer, spanned almost a century. As a young man, he saw the rise of Mahatma Gandhi to the center stage in Indian politics and in old age the fall of the Janata Party government. Among all epithets used to describe Kripalani ideologically, Gandhian is the one that held true for most of his life. Right till the end, Kripalani continued to espouse the cause of the Gandhian way. One of the last messages written by him was addressed to the participants of a convention held from 8 to 11 May 1981. In it, he declared, and I quote, "As I view the station today, I do not see any alternative to the Gandhian way, which was not merely for the achievement of our independence, but also for the reconstruction of our country after freedom." Yet, Kripalani was also equally strong in his commitment towards forging a united opposition front and continued to call for functional unity of the opposition parties to highlight the increasing misdeeds of those in power and even suggested eventually merger of such parties. In advocating for such a front, Kripalani upheld his emphasis on inter-party opposition unity and disregarded the relevance of ideology. This in turn enabled him to support, for instance, the creation of the Janata Party, all of whose constituents did not adhere to the Gandhian way. In fact, after the collapse of the Janata government, Kripalani remarked, and I quote, "It was a sad day when the Janata Party broke up." He further opined that even those who quarreled among themselves earlier now realize that they've come together to save the nation. However, the Janata Party leaders could not overcome the differences and failed to pose an effective challenge to the Congress. Indira Gandhi was once again the Prime Minister when Kripalani passed away on 19 March 1982. On 22nd March 1982, tributes were paid to him in the Lok Sabha. Among those to pay tributes was the socialist leader Madhu Dandavate, who feelingly said, and I quote, "Dada also died as a man with anguish because we who learned at his feet committed the sin of destroying the very instrument which Dada had built, viz. The Janata Party. He administered a pledge to us along with Jai Prakash Narayan that we shall stand by the unity of the Janata Party, but we were sinners, we broke the Janata Party." In 1988, Dandavate raised the issue of Kripalani's birth cemetery without success. Today, there is no statue of Kripalani in the premises of the Indian Parliament. A portrait of Kripalani donated by the Gandhi Ashram Lucknow and Acharya Kripalani Memorial Trust Delhi was unveiled by the then Vice President of India, Bhairav Singh Shekhawat, on 5th December 2006 and installed in the Parliament Museum. In 2013, as he embarked on a journey to fulfill his prime ministerial ambition, the then Chief Minister of Gujarat, Narendra Modi, used the birth anniversary of Kripalani and Maulana Azad to take a dig at his opponent from the Congress party by declaring, and I quote, "It is true that there are historical figures who have been erased from public memory just because they did not belong to a particular family. However, both Kripalani and Azad have evaded being appropriated by Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party. Instead, it is their colleague Vallabhbhai Patel whose legacy has been repeatedly appropriated by them." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Devika, for that very nice exposition. I think we will return and discuss your paper at the end, so we will move on to our second speaker. If I could call on Surbhi Vatsa to turn on their camera, and I will introduce them. Surbhi Vatsa, they is a second-year PhD candidate in the Centre for Historical Studies at JNU. She is currently working on her doctoral dissertation, which studies women's commercial magazines and the readership practices of women in post-independence India. Her primary research interests include feminist studies, gender history, and cultural studies. However, today she's speaking to us on an unrelated topic slightly, revisiting Lohia, his Politics of Language and the Language of Politics, 1958 to 1966. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor MacLean. So I will begin right away. An important actor in driving the socialist politics and the opposition to Congress in the 1950s and 60s was Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia. Lohia's interventions in Indian politics were many. His politics made him persona non grata to the upper caste, English-speaking elite, from Congress supporters to communists, and an entire wave of anti-Congressism was propelled by his brand of politics. His ideas of 60% reservation for the backward caste, class, and gender included, and the slogan, Pichda Paave Sau Mein Saath, have been relevant to this day, and his imprint on the OBC politics in the Hindi belt has been authoritatively established. Despite the many hats that Lohia wore, the one enduring issue that has been invoked and resurrected more recently has been that of Lohia's politics of language and the concomitant question of whether or not Lohia was a language chauvinist. In recent years, the issue of Lohia's politics of language sparked off a war of words between Yogendra Yadav and Sudhanva Deshpande. Yogendra Yadav's essay argued for a position that defended Lohia from the label of language and cultural chauvinist, while Deshpande accused him of monolingualism and cultural supremacy. More recently, in 2019, Kancha Elaya commented that if Lohia's socialism were to have its way, the poor should be relegated to Hindi medium schools and the privileged be allowed to attend good English medium schools. While such polemical commentaries make for an important point of departure in order to understand Lohia's ideas on the language question, I believe room for more extensive inquiries remains. I propose that Lohia's politics of language can only be understood by locating it within an understanding of the full complex of his politics, and this paper is a preliminary exploration in this direction. So I begin with the first section of the paper, which is called Lohia's Politics of Language in his own words. Lohia's own brand of language politics shone forth best in his avowed call for the Angrezi Hatao movement. In a seemingly small and inconsequential personal letter to P.K. Malviya on the 4th of December 1958, Lohia wrote, "Abhi Hindustani ka आंदोलन चल रहा है, अंग्रेजी हटाओ आंदोलन जोर पकड़ सके तो अच्छा हो," which translates as, "At this moment, a movement is on for Hindustani, but it would be better if the movement to banish English could gain force." This statement of Lohia spoke of two ends, the supremacy of Hindustani and the banishment of English. Lohia seemed to be, if not more, equally eager for the latter as for the former. In another speech delivered in 1960, Lohia said, "Sitting tight on the high pedestal of offices, the top men advocate a go-slow policy regarding the removal of English. Having been deprived of all of our belongings, we have become strangers in our own homes. The 10 years of freedom have committed us to a very paradoxical situation. The real owners of the soil have been estranged, and foreign Führer, with all his might and authority, lords over us." In the same speech, Lohia also advocated that until the successors of the imperial state, which were the English-speaking urban upper-class elite of India, who were a minority, were ruling over the majority of the people who were poor and lived in villages, the real revolution, within quotes, would not come. For him, the 40 crore people of India who produced were not the ones who were consuming. It was consumed by the 40 lakh who spoke English and were successors of the British. These 40 lakhs needed to be, within quotes, dethroned because only that would allow the bureaucracy to listen to the dumb masses of the country, close quotes. That would mean a great revolution. Lohia, along with the logic of national esteem or the need to overthrow the mantle of colonialism as a reason for removal of English, gave an internal socio-economic logic to his drive against the language, which blend his class, caste, and language politics together seamlessly. In mobilizing people around the banishment of English, Lohia employed English as the symbol of an exploitative class based in the cities, while Hindi or the other regional languages were identifiers of those exploited and those associated with the villages. Virtue was made out of Indianization of English words. He said that while the educated man went around twisting his native tongue to fit the pronunciations of a foreign language, the rural Indian fitted the foreign words according to his own native tongue. A seamless unity of the former class with a feudal character and alienation from one's own civilization was also drawn up. English, he believed, was not merely the marker of a feudal class, but was a feudal language in itself. This feudal was pitted against the idea of the national or the popular. The idea of a feudal language was not merely a symbolic phrase for Lohia. As mentioned earlier, Lohia formulated the transaction between the users of English and those of Indian languages in economic terms as that of producers and consumers. The understanding was that the perpetuation of English was a deliberate measure to keep out the already oppressed from power sharing. For an Indian child, Lohia said in 1958, one-third of his learning time went into learning a new language which could have been more beneficially applied to acquisition of knowledge. Lohia also broached the question of modernity and its relationship with language. His stand on the issue remained that modernity, especially industrial modernity, did not have to be dependent on the vocabulary of one language. Citing examples of Russia, Germany, and Japan, he would justify greater possibility of progress when knowledge was produced in one's own language. Also, citing examples of the historical rise of English, Lohia argued that at one point in history, it was French that was seen as the language of progress, and at this historical moment it was English. He envisaged the decline of English would happen soon as the language of international transactions and progress. In a report by Patriot, as late as 1964, Lohia was criticized for his formula, open quotes, any language but English. The editor maintaining that such a formula would only lead to chaos. The editorial commentary exhorted the readers to be clear in their minds that as envisaged in the Constitution, the language which should and could replace English would be Hindi. This flexibility that Lohia showed on the language question irked the only Hindi lobby consisting of the likes of R.V. Dhulekar, Raghuveer Sahai and K.M. Munshi. Despite all the criticism of English, Lohia did keep space for optional learning of English as a subject of study during the curriculum debates of the 1940s and of the 50s. What he was vehemently against was the use of English as a language of state and administration. Lohia's stand on the issue of other Indian languages replacing Hindi conflicted each other at various points. While despite his favored position of Hindi, Lohia took the stand that if it came to the question of regional languages instead of Hindi, he would give in to the idea. This was in 1958. He maintained that Hindi was the choicest pick for him on two grounds. One, that statistically it was spoken by the largest population in the country, and two, that other regional languages could not come up with a consensus among themselves to pitch one of them as the national language. He said that if not only in some states, but also at an all India level, Bengali or Marathi was established as the national language, he would concede to the idea, such a move being not too huge a cost to pay for the banishment of English. His preference for Hindi, however, came out in other instances. In a statement from 1960, Lohia was quoted as lambasting Jawaharlal Nehru for having used the word planetarium instead of Nabhamandal. And I quote, "He who says Nabhamandal is very difficult to pronounce is not an Indian. I do not use the word in its physical sense, but in its spiritual sense. For 40 crores of Indians, Nabhamandal and not planetarium is an easy, able, and a good word." While a touch of appeasement, sometimes also fraternity and accommodation, could be found in his comments on other Indian languages, Lohia staunchly believed that Hindi was, after all, the most befitting of all the languages to be the national language, that Hindi was the spiritual medium for India's unity and victory against English. In 1954, on the question of linguistic redistribution, Lohia had said that all such areas that had problems with the implementation of Hindi as official language must immediately be turned bilingual, using both Hindi and their own regional language. At this early juncture, Lohia was talking about Hindi as the national language. Never in Lohia's formulation would one see the use of the term official language. In Lohia's imagination, the one language that would really bind the Indian nation together, administratively and spiritually, would be a national language, not merely a linked language or an official language. These were the terms that were used in contemporaneous debates at the time. This imagination of the national language or the Rashtrabhasha was laden not only with logic and rationality, but also with sentimentality that would come out at different moments in Lohia's articulations. The second section of the paper is called The Language of Lohia's Politics, Language, Caste and Gender. Contrary to his anti-English stance, Lohia was a prolific writer not only in Hindi but also in English. In fact, most of his writings were in English. His extensive use of English stands in stark contradiction to his professed politics of language. His key works, including Fragments of a World Mind, The Mystery of Sir Stafford Cripps, and his treatise on the Sino-Indian situation, were all authored in English. For a public persona grounding his politics in the evils of English language, such practice was much more indicative of the complications and dichotomies of his own ideas than common memory has allowed. Further, the language he employed when writing in Hindi was Khadi Boli. While on the one hand he could write, and I quote, certain groups of Hindus are also pursuing their separatist inclinations. In a burst of uncultured revivalism, they want to miss the substance for such empty satisfactions as naming their country Bharat. And while his critique of the fanatic elements that were trying to strip Hindustani down to a fully Sanskritized language was unequivocal, his own use of Khadi Boli Hindi presents an even greater contradiction than the copious use of English. This his use of Sanskritized Khadi Boli Hindi offsets the politics it professed, which was a vehement critique of Brahmanical authority and class elitism. His spoken language, though not starkly different from the written, carried more colloquial and Urdu words. It is also noteworthy that Lohia, during his lifetime, compiled most of his essays and speeches and published them in translation. He also had his English lectures translated into Hindi, heavily Sanskritized Hindi, and made available for the Hindi reader. His lectures, with extensive use of Marx, Hegel, Spengel, Sorokin, and Adam Smith, were readily translated into Hindi, and these Hindi versions would be peppered with jargons such as Nirikshatmak Sanskriti, Tatkalik Antargyan, Antarvadi Rahasyavadi, and other heavy technical terminology inaccessible to the majority of the population. Nevertheless, this was his attempt at vernacularization of the Western thought, but there is more to this process than can be read superficially. Lohia's references to the West bring out an important facet of his epistemic grounding. While Lohia dealt directly with ideas of thinkers and scholars from the West, ranging from Marx and Hegel to Toynbee and Louis Mumford, his interpretation of them is not what we are primarily concerned with. His reading of these scholars was an exercise in relation to the history of the Indian subcontinent as he understood it, and in order to make sense of it. This tendency of Lohia's thought to use the West as the point of reference and draw similes and metaphors from non-Indian settings, a process he simultaneously also denounced, serves to counterbalance any ideas of Lohia being a blind cultural supremacist, or in Gopal Guru's terminology, of a Desi imagination. Lohia felt that the banishment of English would be a stratagem in challenging the European and imperial hegemonic dependency from India, but his own intellectual thought world was deeply informed by European ideas, though these ideas were not merely to be replicated in the Indian context. Lohia, remembered as the doyen of North Indian caste politics from this period, had launched a scathing critique of the Banya Brahmin nexus of the ruling castes of India, a term at one targeting upper caste hegemony as well as his own caste location. The term Banya Brahman was a recurring motif in his writing and in his speeches throughout his career, a term that also appeared in 1953 in another essay attacking the then President of India for having reverentially washed the feet of 200 Brahmins in Varanasi. It is in his reprimands and ridicules to congressmen and especially caste Hindu congressmen that Lohia's scathing criticism brings together his use of vernacular tropes. He writes, to bathe another's feet on the ground that he is a Brahmin is to guarantee the continuance of the caste system of poverty and sadness. From this to Nepal Baba, and a pledged vote under the spell of Ganga water is a chain. Close quotes. The irreverence of his language, irreverence to Brahmanical respectability, also mixed organically with his ideas on gender and sex. The intermeshing of Lohia's professed politics of language and caste formed an organic whole with his ideas on gender. What strikes me as really astounding and almost provocative in his thought and language was that while talking of such matters, especially given his contemporaneous socio-political setting, his ideas on sex almost verged on what could be today called sex positivity, and it was a heavy challenge to Brahmanical morality. His proposition that a criteria for government jobs be that Dvij Shudra marriage was mandatory was nothing short of incendiary. And I quote him: if a girl knocks around and elopes and mischances into illegitimacy, that is all part of bargain to achieve normal relationships between man and woman and contains no stain at all. Celibacy is generally a prison house. It is time that young men and women revolted against such puerilities. They should ever remember that there are only two unpardonable crimes in the code of sexual conduct: rape and telling lies or breach of promise. Lohia's thought world and political language, however, had another side to it. His metaphors and metonymy were as strongly couched in Hindu cultural idioms, much to the annoyance of some contemporaries, especially his use of the tropes of Ramayana and Mahabharata, tropes that already formed a part of the psyche and common sense of the people. And I use the term common sense here with its Gramscian ramifications. While he launched critiques on the personality of Ram and infallibility of the Ramayana, this did not upset his belief in the ideas of infallibility of the Indian culture and its primary identification with the Hindu identity. While making public speeches, Draupadi and Savitri of Hindu mythological corpus came as easily to Lohia as did Western philosophers. His responses to the gender question at Samajwadi Yuvajan Sabha Shikshan Shivir in 1962 were also peppered with couplets from Hindu scriptural texts. Lohia's criticisms of Nehru and the Congress came out best with his use of similar Hindu tropes. His comparison of Nehru with Vashisht and his urge for the Valmiki style of political culture once again fell into the use of Hindu metaphors. Even while trying to challenge Brahmanical supremacy, while urging for Valmikis to be allowed in politics, and despite his vehement critique of Hindu uprightness, right from Parshuram up till Prime Minister Nehru himself, Lohia could not break out of the Hindu idiom. So, how do we make sense of Lohia and his politics of language? First, in order to understand Lohia's politics of language, I go back to the late MSS Pandian and his proposition that all allegiances for any language need not be cast directly into the mold of linguistic nationalism. Alternative ways of imagining the politics of language need exercising. For Lohia, the question of language was not about creating a linguistic nationality with a primordial root or a foundational fiction, wiping off all other languages. His stance also differed markedly from the only Hindi lobby mentioned earlier, who went to the extent of saying that anyone who did not know Hindu did not deserve to live in India. The issue of language for him was inextricably linked with the question of caste and class both. While on the one hand, he would rail against the Hindu chauvinism of the administration in places where Hindi was being imposed upon Bengali students, while he would draw unity between poverty-stricken dhoti-clad Brahmin within quotes and his English-speaking counterpart, and urge this poor Brahmin to see his brotherhood lay not with this upper-class counterpart, but with the other poor lower caste Ahirs and Kurmis, at the end of the day, his rootedness in Sanskritized Hindi and Hindu idiom would become more and more glaring in opposition to Congress and Jawaharlal Nehru, and would be increasingly so in the period post-1963. The contexts of these responses are important, therefore, and these differing responses complicate any labels that could be simplistically used for Lohia. The comparison made by Pandian of Lohia's brand of advocacy of Hindi and the Tamil self-respect movement is also instructive. Like Tamil resistance, Lohia's struggle for Hindi also seemed to work from a subaltern logic, wherein he saw this linguistic identity threatened by another, as Tamil, for instance, felt threatened by Hindi. The complex of relationships thus formed by these linguistic struggles cannot be reduced to a debate of a monolithic imperialism and resistance. Their resistances need to be understood as parallel, horizontal processes. What this brief survey makes clear, if we were to draw from Madhav Prasad's work, is that Lohia's advocacy of Hindi was only trying to create a community of Hindi speakers and not a single linguistic community stripped of its diversities. In the longer run, however, with development of populist politics in the Hindi belt, Lohia's idea of English imperialism and the removal of English from curriculum by Karpuri Thakur in Bihar would be critiqued by successors such as Lalu Prasad Yadav. Lohia would be and is still criticized for having been responsible for the backwardness of the people of Bihar by having inspired the removal of English as a compulsory subject of study in the later period. However, this issue would need another, more detailed examination. Ram Manohar Lohia, unlike his counterparts, both favorable and non-favorable to him, has not left behind a very daunting legacy. While vestiges of Lohia remain in the socialist and OBC politics in North India, claiming his political lineage, the figure seems to stand at the margin of the historical canon. Unlike both the dyads of Nehru Gandhi or Periyar Ambedkar, Lohia could not carve a lasting niche for himself. And yet I feel he's a political actor worth knowing more about. It is here that I find Gopal Guru's categorization of Desi, derivative, and beyond very helpful in situating Lohia on a political spectrum. Lohia's brand of politics, language, caste, and gender offers very complex attitudes. While on the one hand, he advocated for the banishment of English from administrative and state procedures, on the other, his own epistemic roots frequently showed themselves to be deep in Western thought and philosophy. While he did not associate either with a Ram Rajya, he also did not associate with a Prabuddha Bharat. And despite being an avowed socialist, unlike the communists, he could never come to associate himself with another socialist nation or a pre existing socialist experiment as a model. While with all his linguistic differences, he would call Periyar, within quotes, a rebel child of Mother India for breaking the sacred thread, he would still ask for Gandhi's pictures to not be defiled. While he embraced modernity, he could not bring himself to acquiesce with the language that modernity brought with itself. While he wished for a complete dismantling of the caste structure and the caste gender complex, he could not bring himself to overthrow the mantle of Hinduism. While he could sympathize with the anger and bitterness of Ambedkar or Periyar, he could not bring himself to accept it. To me, this politics of Lohia's seems to be caught between Desi and derivative, while trying very hard to conceptualize a beyond and yet stopping short of it. While intellectually Lohia could stand with the cause of the dismantling of caste, and while it was to this end that he also wanted to push the banishment of English, the language of the caste and class elite, and yet Lohia seemed to be unable to grasp the full implication of the use of English for the depressed castes, or the need for violent action against Brahmanism, or the anger and bitterness of Ambedkar or Periyar. Lohia, with all his calls for action against the threadwearer and with his calling out of the Banya Brahmin nexus, could not think of a beyond, perhaps due to his own caste location and class location and absence of what Gopal Guru calls experience. Lohia, therefore, and his politics in a number of ways, I believe, represented a bridge that could have been and yet was not. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that extremely rich paper, Surbhi. I look forward to the discussion on this. I'd like now to call on Tania Chakravarty, who has completed her BA, MA and MPhil from the Department of History at Yadavpur University in Calcutta. She's recently completed her PhD in History from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at the University of London. Her area of expertise includes social history of modern India, environmental history of modern India, urban history of late 19th and early 20th century India, and history of constitutional reforms in early 20th century India. Today, she's going to speak to us about Serving the Poor is Like Serving God Himself, Chittaranjan Das, and the Calcutta Corporation in the interwar years. The floor is yours. No, we can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Sure. Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are. Thank you, Dr. Chakravarty.
Thank you, Professor MacLean, for the introduction. As mentioned, the title of my paper is Serving the Poor is Like Serving God Himself, Chittaranjan Das and the Calcutta Corporation in the Interwar Years. The Government of India Act of 1919 created greater political opportunities for Indian nationalists in the provincial government, especially in the municipal arena. As the local self-government became a state subject in the newly created diarchy, a new nationalist civic discourse entered the municipal government. The interwar years saw local self-government in Bengal become an instrument of nation building or national strengthening. One such institution of local self-government was the Calcutta Corporation. After the Calcutta municipal elections of 1924, the Swaraj Party took leadership of the new Calcutta Corporation. It was led by Chittaranjan Das as the mayor and Subhash Chandra Bose as the chief executive officer. This new corporation became a tool of a nationalist project to form citizens of a nation. It sought to create a productive citizen body through education, medical relief, nutrition, and improved living conditions. But this nationalist project and discourse came to mean something more than a civilizing mission on Western terms. According to C.R. Das, Swaraj was the expression of the national mind. He noted, Swaraj begins when the true development of a nation begins. True development of the Indian nation was the ultimate goal of Swaraj. Nationalism for Das was a means to an end. He wrote, Nationalism is merely a process in self-realization, self-development, and self-fulfillment. It is not an end in itself. The growth and development of nationalism is necessary so that humanity may realize itself, develop itself, and fulfill itself. Do not forget the larger claim of humanity in your pride of nationalism. In the presidential address for the Goa session of the Congress in 1922, Das elaborated on his scheme of a nationalist government. He saw democracy as a spiritual experience. It was not a mere rule of the majority, but a network of human relations. Das's scheme of the nationalist government was marked by a strong negation of the bureaucratic rule in India and an appreciation for local self-government. For him, the real foundation for him, the real foundation of a democratic government could only be laid at a local level. He wrote, To me, the practical autonomy of local centers are more important than either provincial autonomy or central responsibility. And if the choice lay between the two, I would unhesitatingly accept the autonomy of the local centers. I maintain that real Swaraj can only be attained by vesting the power of government in these local centers. At the same time, Das was very critical of a government that heavily depends on its bureaucracy. He noted, I am not asking for another bureaucracy, another oligarchy in the place of bureaucracy that there is at present. In my opinion, bureaucracy is bureaucracy, be that the bureaucracy of Englishmen or of Anglo Indians or of Indians. We want self government by the people and for the people. We want self government in which every individual of this country, be the poorest Ryat or the richest Zamindar, will have his legitimate share. In the 1924 Calcutta municipal elections, the Swarajists took control of the municipal corporation. Chittaranjan Das, as the mayor of the newly elected corporation, wanted to create a truly popular body out of the Calcutta Municipal Corporation, a body that represented the masses. He understood that Swaraj could not be achieved solely through the devotion, sacrifice, and intellect of the upper class Indians. It required mass participation. He noted, Many of us believe that the middle class must win Swaraj for the masses. I, for one, will protest against it because that will inevitably lead to the concentration of the power in the hands of middle class. My ideal Swaraj will never be satisfied unless the people cooperate with us in its achievement. However, Das realized that material poverty was an immense obstacle to active citizenship. The urban poor of Calcutta were deprived of any civic voice for too long. Further, their living conditions impeded the development of a sense of their own rights and entitlements. Hence, measures were to be taken to improve the conditions of the working classes so that their impeded sense of civic duty and rights could be revived. As securing the cooperation of the urban poor was imperative to the cause of the Swaraj, thus urged the corporation to take upon the responsibility to improve the conditions of the urban poor of Calcutta. After the municipal elections of 1924, in reply to a welcome address in Howrah, he said, Unless the energies and resources of the town are devoted to the services of the poor, it is in vain that it is in vain for the people to capture the resources of the municipality. Based on this ideal, Das tried to direct the activities of the corporation to the service of the poor. He borrowed an old Bengali religious idiom called the Doridra Narayan, which meant serving the poor is like serving God Himself. In his inaugural address as the mayor of Calcutta Corporation, Das declared, "It is the great ideal of the Indian people that they regard the poor as Doridra Narayan. To them, God comes in the shape of the poor, and the service of the poor is the service of God to the Indian mind. I shall therefore try to direct your activities to the service of the poor." He identified he identified a primary cluster of material entitlements which fell within the scope of the rights of urban poor. They were free primary education, free medical relief for the poor, purer and cheaper milk supply, better supply of filtered and unfiltered water, better sanitation in slum areas, housing of the poor, development of suburban areas, improved transport facilities, and greater efficiency of administration at a cheaper cost. This paper will focus on three primary areas of welfare services in which the corporation took active initiative, namely healthcare, food, and education. Chittaranjan Das died on June 1925. After his death, his inaugural address as the mayor of Calcutta Corporation was reprinted in the pages of the Calcutta Municipal Gazette as a way of reaffirming the pledge of Doridra Narayan. As stated earlier, Das believed that government should start at the local level. For him, the individual was the basis of an integrated neighborhood, and, and this integrated neighborhood was the real foundation of the unified state. Based on this ideal, the corporation's operations now became an exercise in the everyday political. Medical services provided by the Calcutta Corporation came to occupy an important role in this program. Urban migration and demographic changes after the First World War brought questions of health to the fore. The Swarajists sought to use the corporation to keep watch and extend medical services to poorer sections of the society. Several allopathic, Ayurvedic, and Unani dispensaries were established and maintained by the corporation to provide free medical services to the poor. However, when it came to supervising and managing the health of the poorest sections of the city, the corporation came up with the idea of creating health associations in each ward of the city. In 1924, the Public Health Standing Committee of the Calcutta Corporation created a subcommittee to thoroughly investigate and formulate a scheme for combating diseases like malaria, Kala Azar, and tuberculosis in the city. The subcommittee recommended the formation of a health association in each ward. Their task was to take up all questions of public health in their respective wards, to adopt necessary measures in that behalf, and to carry propaganda work. The scheme was accepted by the corporation in September 1924, and 13 ward health associations were started in that year. The associations provided considerable free medical relief to the poor, and by 1929 their number has increased to 29. Although the main aim of these associations was disease prevention, treatment formed an essential part of this scheme. It was noted that in order to rouse the sanitary conscience of the people, the corporation had to give them something in return, preferably in the form of ready medical services. Infant mortality, especially in the low-income neighborhoods of the city, was another concern for the newly elected corporation. For the corporation, the question of infant mortality in the slums of Calcutta was closely associated to the milk supply problem in the city. In order to minimize the death rate in this respect, a scheme was created for the establishment of free milk kitchen and baby clinics at each district of the city. In the year 1925, two milk kitchens were opened in the city. By 1930, their numbers have increased to seven. In addition to the supply of pure milk, these centers also acted as medical clinics. The babies were periodically checked and mothers were instructed on health and hygiene practices in respect to their children. Now let us turn to food. Food was important in the nationalist imagination for creating a healthy citizen body and nation. Colonial failures in the realm of food management meant that the promise of Swaraj was tied to the guarantee of food for all. As a result, the Swarajist Corporation became heavily involved in determining the normal constituents of food articles and drugs intended for human consumption. This also extended to the search for adulterated food products that were sold in the markets and restaurants of the city. A branch of the municipal administration became exclusively concerned with the inspection of food and restaurants. By 1926-1927, there were 10 food inspectors associated with the corporation. In addition to these officers, there was one food inspector who inspected consignments of foodstuffs that entered Calcutta from outside through the Howrah Bridge. Special care was taken to see that food articles sold in the Calcutta markets and restaurants were unadulterated. Some of the food items that became central to this discussion were ghee or clarified butter, mustard oil, and milk. They were considered to be essential items of consumption in Bengali families and were regarded as primary targets for adulteration. The corporation was keener on policing the producers and distributors of food rather than food itself. The, Such producers and distributors of food either belonged to lower classes or migrated to Calcutta from neighboring provinces. It was primarily the lower class people like the milkmen, cooks, and waiters who faced the wrath of the corporation as unhygienic and corrupt. Letters and articles published in the Calcutta Municipal Gazette and contemporary newspapers held the immigrant upcountry milkmen, the Oriya cooks, and the Marwari businessmen responsible for choking the city with congestion, shortage, and disease ridden food products. It is important to note that the corporation's efforts were not just about inspecting food products so as to create a healthy citizen body. It was also about disciplining society itself, and in particular about policing the lower caste or migrant population who produced and distributed the food. Now let us talk about the educational policy of the Swarajist Corporation. In his inaugural address as the mayor of the Calcutta Corporation, C.R. Das stressed the importance of free primary education for the proper upbringing of the future citizens of the city. His ultimate object was to make such education universal, free, and compulsory. In May 1924, the corporation appointed a special committee to prepare a scheme for the extension and improvement of primary, technical, and industrial education in Calcutta. The committee recommended creating model primary schools in each ward of the city and opening a number of schools in borrowed buildings in slum areas. In 1924, there were only 19 primary schools in Calcutta run by the corporation. By 1927, their numbers have increased to 139 with over 16,000 students on the roll. The syllabus of these free primary schools included both academic subjects as well as subjects like physical drills, scouting, and hygiene practices. Students were taught about the importance of proper nutrition, a disciplined lifestyle, physical exercise, and body cleanliness. Sports and physical culture was a central part of this educational program. Technical or vocational skills were also imparted in order to promote ideas of self-help. Therefore, education became the means to create a better skilled population that could help the nation advance materially and physically. This national education movement, as championed by the Swarajist Corporation, faltered due to lack of proper administration and financial resources. The Hartog Committee in 1930 complained that although there was a sudden influx of students into the primary schools after 1924, most of the students have failed to attain even initial literacy. The Hartog Committee blamed the inefficiency and ill-conceived enthusiasm of the Indian provincial ministers for, for this failure. However, the problem ran deeper. However, the problem ran deeper. The education system that the Swarajist Corporation inherited was the product of decades-long imperial legislation. Before 1924, the government of Bengal had largely depended on the privately managed schools for the extension of primary education in the city. Hence, the Swarajist ministers felt that the primary objective of national education system should be to increase the number of schools in the city and bring more people into the project of formal institutionalized education. As a result, the possibility and extent of providing educational instructions to the people often took precedence over quality itself. I would try to conclude my paper now. Yeah, I would be concluding my paper now. Yeah. Thus used his victory in the Calcutta municipal elections to enact his vision of a nationalist government. This vision of a nationalist government was located at the municipal level and was marked by a severe critique of bureaucracy. He wanted to create a truly nationalist body out of the Calcutta Municipal Corporation with the cooperation of the urban poor. Thus drew up a municipal program based on the Hindu on the Bengali Hindu religious ideal of Doridra Narayan. He used the Hindu ideal of piousness and seva to create the framework of a Swarajist government. This government would provide more services to the people, and in return the people were to make use of these services to safeguard their bodies for the benefit of the nation. However, in practice, the Swarajist Corporation focused more on mapping, policing, and managing the body of the urban poor rather than seeking their active and voluntary engagement. As uneducated lower class people, the urban poor were considered morally and culturally inferior and hence susceptible to corruption and insanitary practices. It became the responsibility of the Swarajist Corporation and its ministers to keep them under vigilance and instill them with a sense of urban citizenship. But the idea of urban citizenship that the Swarajist Corporation tried to indoctrinate the urban poor with was based on the idea of a normative Hindu upper caste citizen. Hence, Calcutta Corporation in the interwar years became an exercise in future political leadership where the Swarajist politicians tried to present themselves as future leaders of a as possible leaders of a future nation, and Doridra Narayan came to be translated into a set of Hindu upper caste ideas that the Swarajist politicians were eager to impose on the urban poor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chakravarty. We'll come back to the discussion of your paper at the end, and we'll move straight to our next paper, which is, I'm happy to introduce Prabal Sharan Agrawal, who is a PhD candidate also at the Centre for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He wrote his MPhil dissertation on Ram Prasad Bismil and Ideas of Revolution in Colonial India, 1916 to 1927. Currently, he's working on his PhD thesis entitled From Revolutionary Nationalism to Marxism, Radical Intelligentsia and the Question of Indian Revolution, 1930 to 2017. Passionate about the history of anti-colonial struggles in South Asia, Prabal has written several research papers and articles in the political history of the Indian revolutionary movement in the 20th century for reputed journals, Studies in Legal History, Summerhill, and also to popular online media platforms like The Wire, Newsflick, etc. Right now, he's working on a book on the intellectual history of anti-colonial revolutionaries between 1900 and 1931. His focus is on the lesser-known revolutionary activists from the under-researched region of Uttar Pradesh. Please, the floor is yours, Prabal.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot for introducing me. And it's really fortunate that I am presenting a paper on the revolutionary movement, and you are here, an expert on the theme. So thank you for being here, ma'am. And hello, everyone. So the topic of my paper is the intellectual history of anti-colonial revolutionary movement from 1900 to 1930. It is usually argued by historians that the Indian revolutionary movement aimed only at somehow overthrowing the colonial state with its fuzzy schemes and by using terrorist methods, and had no transformative theory and practice before the emergence of socialist ideas. Bhagat Singh and his comrades are considered as the first group of revolutionaries who had a radical program and ideology due to their Marxist leanings. Recently, Ghadar Party has also got some recognition for its democratic and secular ideology. Nevertheless, the political philosophy of Bengal revolutionaries continues to be dubbed as hyper-masculinity in response to colonial attempts to effeminate the Bengali, and physical culture is considered core of their movement. This kind of conclusion has emerged due to the study of the movement in Bengal in isolation instead of looking at the movement at the level of entire subcontinent. This has also led to a lot of assumptions about the movement outside Bengal. Physical culture was one important aspect of revolutionary movement, but not central to it, I would like to argue, even in Bengal. It is like saying that Gandhian philosophy was all about wearing khadi and nothing else. This paper attempts to study the Indian revolutionary movement, not only in the national, but also in the international context, on one hand, and on the other hand, engages with the regions other than Bengal, which have been overlooked to get a more complex picture of the movement. Due to the limited scope of the present study, I will focus on the ideas of 5 major revolutionary thinkers, namely Aurobindo Ghosh, Lala Hardyal, Sachindranath Sanyal, Ram Prasad Bismil, and Bhagat Singh. I will study the ideas of these thinkers to argue that even before accepting socialism, the revolutionaries did have a program for social transformation, and their strategies and tactics, when seen in the light of their writings, do have a radical politics of their own. Scholars have pointed out to 2 aspects of revolutionary philosophy: Hindu revivalism and revolutionary ideas from the West. As a whole, mainstream Indian nationalism has also been understood as selective picking up of elements from India's quote-unquote spiritual and cultural heritage and Western ideas of the nation state. For the process of nation building, it has been argued the role of state was seen as central by Indian nationalists. Some scholars argue that this nationalist project of imposing homogeneity among the Indian people from above ignored the inherent contradictions in the Indian society. While revolutionaries were also a part of this nationalist project for a long period of time, they differed in 2 significant ways. First, in contrast to popular belief and some recent scholarly work, they really had concrete vision for the capture of state power, unlike other nationalists, and tried their best to realize it. Second, they were also one among those political forces which pioneered in attempting to deal with some of the internal contradictions which the homogenizing nationalism ignored, especially the issue of class. On both these counts, revolutionaries also made solid theoretical criticism of mainstream nationalism, which could only be recovered from their polemical writings and propaganda and not just their actions. In this paper, I will focus on 3 core issues of revolutionary thought: armed struggle, social transformation, and internationalism. One thing that the revolutionaries were sure about was the inevitability of the armed struggle. They differed and debated about the ways to organize one, but they had no illusions about the character of the colonial state, which they dubbed as a terrorist regime that had to be resisted with counter-terror. The colonial state had three coercive forces to repress any kind of political resistance: the police, the army, and the Indian civil servants. The first had a truly colonial character, as it was controlled by European officials and lieutenant governors, with Indians occupying only subordinate positions. Army was a more powerful tool of state terror, as for every 2 or 3 Indian sepoy, there was one British soldier. It was only during the Second World War that more Indianization of the army took place. The ICS, on one hand, was an instrument of repression, and on the other hand, a bulwark for reaction due to its proximity with the exploitative classes of the Indian society. The revolutionaries targeted all three of them. While the police and the bureaucracy were always its targets of attack, they tried to win over Indian soldiers in the army throughout the first half of 20th century. The attacks on police and bureaucrats were made to boost the morale of the people and reach out to them. The key agenda for most of the revolutionaries was to recruit students and lower middle class youth. Once a nationwide network of secret societies was created, the next step in the program was inciting the soldiers in the Indian army into open rebellion, preferably with the help of foreign powers. A replica of 1857 revolt was one of the most influential visions of seizure of power. The second core agenda for revolutionaries, I argue, was social transformation. From the very beginning of the revolutionary movement, we see a concern for the plight of the peasantry or the miserable conditions of the working class and a criticism of the Congress leadership for ignoring them. However, the position of the subaltern in the revolutionary program was of diverse and sometimes contradictory views. Aurobindo, one of the earliest dominant figures of the Indian revolutionary movement, writes something very revealing while attacking the elitism of the Congress. He says, and I quote, "The proletariat is the real key of the situation. Torpid he is and immobile. He is nothing of an actual force, but he is a very great potential force. And whoever succeeds in understanding and eliciting his strength becomes by the very fact master of the future. The right and fruitful policy for the bourgeois, the only policy that has any chance of eventual success, is to base his cause upon the adroit management of the proletariat. He must awaken and organize the entire power of the country and thus multiply infinitely his volume and significance, the better to attain supremacy as much social as political." Quote ends. Here the writer is clearly concerned more about the interests of the bourgeois than the proletariat and wants the former to use the latter to achieve its goals. This can be seen as a major limitation of Aurobindo's revolutionary vision, at least till 1894 when he was writing these lines, which does not extend to the emancipation of the subaltern and calls upon to mobilize them for the interests of the urban elite. There is a radical change, however, in the revolutionary program within a decade, and the manifesto of the Anushilan Samiti, of which Aurobindo was soon to become the top leader, is bold enough to announce. In Anushilan's dreamland, there won't be poor or illiterate, coward or wicked, nor would there be any sick. To create such a society, all kind of inequalities would have to be destroyed. In presence of inequalities, the humanity of humans cannot be recovered. By destroying economic, social, communal, and provincial disparities, equality between all men needs to be established. Only a national government can do this. Anushilan's dreamland cannot be realized in conditions of slavery. Hence, Anushilan declares a war on slavery. Anushilan demands complete independence for India. This was written in 1904, much before Bhagat Singh. This change occurred as the leadership of the movement passed on from the intellectuals coming out of the old landed elite to the emerging lower middle class intelligentsia, represented by students coming from poor peasant background. For Lala Hardayal, founder of the Gadar movement, subaltern aspirations was an even more pressing issue. As being the leader of the Gadar party in the United States, he was organizing migrant workers, agricultural laborers, students, and petty traders for an armed struggle to liberate India. He was also an upper class radical like Aurobindo, who was mobilizing the subaltern for his long cherished goal of Indian independence. But along with the language of religion, which Aurobindo argued should be used to win over the proletariat, Hardayal also uses the language of class and underlines the internal contradictions within the Indian society. Hence, the political program of Gadar firmly stands for a democratic republic of United States of India. Whether it is due to his acquaintance with socialist and anarchist literature, or due to the popular character of Gadar movement, Hardayal is able to come up with a vision of social transformation, which may appear to be deficient from some theoretical standpoints, but certainly had the potential to be truly radical at that time. One of his important comrades, Tarak Nath Das, asked young India, and I quote, demand a revolution in social ideals so that humanity and liberty would be valued above property. Special privilege would not overshadow equal opportunity, and women should not be kept under subjection. Quote ends. Maya Ramnath, in her recent study of the Gadar movement, writes about the relationship between Hardyal and the subaltern. Darsi Chennaiya, a Gadarite, recalled that as intellectuals arose from among the Punjabi laborers, they began to contribute articles and poems to the newspaper and to address public meetings. They were sincere and brave, though until quite recently ignorant and illiterate. But now they had suddenly become politically conscious, highly patriotic, and intensely revolutionary. As a result, the Gadar movement passed rapidly into the hands of these masses. As a leader, Hardyal evinced great confidence in their potential as revolutionary fighters. This may be why they liked him as well. Moreover, while he may have been a professional intellectual, he was a Punjabi nonetheless. Hardyal happily supported and encouraged their vernacular contributions. Chennaiya continued, even when they contained mistakes or abusive words, precisely because they were, to use an anachronistic term, organic. Ramnath also quotes Hardyal's views on the working class, and I quote, labor must think in terms of the whole world. Should one nation acquire freedom, the rich of another nation will crush it. We want not only economic emancipation, but moral and intellectual emancipation as well. The rich and respectable cannot lead us. We will have two kinds of leaders. First, the ascetics, who have renounced riches and respectability for the love of the working man, men like Kropotkin, the Saint Francises, and Saint Bernards of labor. Secondly, we have the sons of the soil themselves, who must take up their own cross and lead their brothers on. The workers and the women are two enslaved classes and must fight their battles together. We want central labor colleges where our young men can be taught, not by money, but by men. We do not want endowments because endowments with their incomes are another form of exploitation. The poor must love the poor. The shame of labor is that the poor must accept charity from the rich. We are not so poor, but we can care for our own poor. We must stand together. Quote end. Hardyal condemned parliamentarism as it was useless, he said, for labor to attempt to free itself using the weapons furnished by capitalism. But he had equally strong criticism for the other extreme, which he had previously advocated. He says, terrorism is a waste of force and gives the other party a chance for needless persecution. For Sachindranath Sanyal, founder of the Hindustan Republican Association, revolutionary theory has to be a combination of Vedanta and socialism. He forcefully argued later that this position was not due to his lack of understanding of socialism, as some of his comrades and most scholars claim, but due to his irresolvable differences with the materialist philosophy. He claims he accepts the economic program of Marxism, but is opposed to its dialectical materialist philosophy and also its materialist understanding of history. He upholds the significance of religion and idealism. He compares communist utopia to the sannyas ashram of Hinduism, as both depend on the highest evolution of human life, that is, renunciation of private property. He writes that at an early stage, he thought that perhaps a successful revolution in India would lead to the spread of this aspect of Hindu philosophy in the world. He argues that one who has not understood the essence of Indian civilization and historical role it has to play in the emancipation of humanity cannot realize the fallacies of communism and the fairness of his own revolutionary program. He answers to his comrade Manmat Nath Gupta's criticism that he had no idea of class struggle, class consciousness, and class politics. He explains that he accepted that after independence, the Indian state would protect the interests of workers and peasants in contrast to other revolutionaries in history, in contrast to other revolutions in history which betrayed them. But there was no need of class struggle to do this. He claimed that the revolution he envisaged was meant for these classes only. He also explains the reason behind not adding the term communist or socialist to his party's name. His close associate, Jayachandra Vidyalankar, pointed out that such a step would antagonize their sympathizers from the propertied class. Ram Prasad Bismil was another prominent leader of Sanyal's HRA, but his worldview was different from him. Despite being religious, he was not an idealist like Sanyal. His approach to revolution was linked to more mundane issues of life. Miserable conditions of the peasantry, of Dalits, and of women bothered him more than the study of Vedanta philosophy done by his Bengali comrades. As a teenager, he reacted very sentimentally to the repressive measures of the colonial state, the exploitation of poor by the feudal classes, and as he grew up, he became more sensitive to the injustice and oppression around him. That's why he used the pen name Bismil, which means wounded. His heart was wounded by the sorrows of his motherland. His political philosophy had empathy for all the oppressed and exploited sections of the conservative society in which he lived: peasants, workers, Dalits, and women. The specter of bloodbath during the revolution always haunted him, and he vowed never to take any human's life. And yet, this man was an armed revolutionary and the leader of the military wing of the Revolutionary Party. When Bismil was arrested in September 1925, among other articles claimed to have been recovered from him, there was a copy with notes on Hindu religion and Samyavad, alternatively used for socialism or communism in the 1920s. Translation of an extract was made as follows during the Kakori trial. It is the duty of every Hindu that he, while observing the principles of his own religion, should preach communism. At every place, communist societies should be established. Every person, be he young or old, male or female, should become the member of the society. There are many defects in Russian communism. When communism will be started in India according to the ancient Hindu religion, then alone the world would realize its true nature, because this communism would be for all living beings. One will not be the enemy of other, so much so that the very idea of violence would disappear from the world. Vedic Raj will be established and everyone will enjoy peace and happiness. While the authenticity and translation of this extract is questionable, it resembles with the worldview of people like Bismil and Sanyal, who tried to locate communism/socialism in Hinduism. Bismil's discourse on revolution in his autobiography, written in the condemned cell 2 years later, shows a deep, far understanding of the class struggle than Sanyal, perhaps also because of his admiration for the writings of Hardayal, while his comrade Sanyal was more a follower of Aurobindo and Vivekanand. Bismil upheld the principles of modern democracy in his autobiography and asserted that revolutionary movement has a historical role to play in its establishment. But he advocates going beyond bourgeois democracy, which he calls Arthtantra, rule of money. He cites the example of America and France, where revolutions established bourgeois democracy and workers and peasants continue to fight for their rights. He calls the Bolshevik Revolution as establishment of true democracy. Another layer of Bismil's ideas is his criticism of urban way of living, lawyers and physicians, and celebration of rural life, despite recognizing the class and caste contradictions in it. This has similarity with Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, but Bismil makes no mention of it and instead attacks Gandhi's non-cooperation movement for avoiding villages. He advocates learning of handicraft, artisanal skills, and usage of Hindi language. He insists on equal access to natural resources for all, and to all kind of domination and establishment of true democracy worldwide. Sanyal's and Bismil's most famous protege, Bhagat Singh, started with radical nationalism of his gurus, moved towards anarchist philosophy, subsequently got influenced by scientific socialism, and finally became a committed Marxist. As an anarchist, he made a vehement attack on God, state, and private property. He held Bakunin in great respect. Shiv Verma, one of Bhagat Singh's closest comrades, explains that it was Lala Chhabildas, his principal at National College, Lahore, and Sohan Singh Josh, communist leader and editor of Kirti, who converted Bhagat Singh to socialism. Singh and his comrades not only studied literature on Marxism and Soviet Union available in libraries, but also arranged to get proscribed literature from England. Major radical intellectuals of the time, like Radha Mohan Gokul, Satyabhakt, Hasrat Mohani, Ganesh Vidyarthi, also influenced the revolutionaries a lot. Bhagat Singh argued that short life of the Revolutionary Party was inevitable. He was of the opinion that there was no need to expand the party too much. Even if few individuals do their job efficiently, they can create a suitable environment in which the upcoming mass revolution could be organized in a proper way. This job was propaganda by deed, through which a revolutionary spirit could be developed in the country to eradicate what he saw as the reactionary atmosphere of the late 20s in form of communalism and constitutionalism. My last theme is, and I'm concluding, my last theme is internationalism of Indian revolutionaries. Another important element was internationalism, which had an uninterrupted continuity in the 5 decades of revolutionary movement, in contrast to some recent writings which claim otherwise. Aurobindo wanted an armed revolution in India, which would throw out the British and revive India's past glory so that it can lead humanity to the next stage of evolution through its cultural and spiritual heritage. According to Maya Ramnath, the Ghadar party also debated the principles of nationalism and internationalism. Hardayal declared himself an internationalist in 1912 who did not believe in narrow views of nationalism. He came out of the same revolutionary discourse theorized by Aurobindo and expanded it due to his anarchist and socialist leaning. Tania and Bismil also upheld the internationalism emphasized by the Indian revolutionary movement. They announced that after liberating India, revolutionaries will strive for the independence of other slave nations. Their ultimate goal was to end exploitation of man by man in any manner. Bhagat Singh more powerfully acknowledged the internationalist character of the movement and declared that he saw his party as a constituent of the Third International. He also came up with his theory of world federation, which he claimed would be essential for the emancipation of humankind once all kind of exploitation of man by another man and of a nation by another nation comes to an end. Now the question arises is that why in the first place the Indian revolutionaries had to profess internationalism in such a strong manner? There are many plausible explanations. One can be myths like civilizing mission of Indian cultural heritage were created to catch the fancy of college-going youth. Another can be the strategic needs of Indian revolutionaries to ally with radicals throughout the world to facilitate both logistical and moral support for their national cause. In case of HRA and HSRA, internationalism can also be attributed to their socialist leanings. But from the reading of texts produced by Aurobindo, Hardayal, Sanyal, Bismil, and Bhagat Singh, another important explanation emerges out. It is linked to the psychology of the colonial intelligentsia, which was subordinized at one level due to their colonial experience, but was also sometimes socially better placed than the crores of their fellow countrymen, as in the case of Aurobindo or Hardayal, or belonged to the same underprivileged sections of the peasantry like Bismil and Sanyal. The exploitation around them made them rebel from their own society and placed arms in the hands of some of them. The feeling of how to change the world is outpoured in their writings, and the immediate restrictions which they see in their dreams of liberation is India's slavery. Hence, their anti-colonialism was not necessarily nationalist. It was expressed in many different ways in the first half of 20th century. The mind of radical intelligentsia also became sensitive to the problems of the world, and their idealism inspired them to take bold initiatives in figuring out the solution. Revolutionary movement can be perhaps seen as one such outburst of youth rebellion, which envisioned in a variety of ways Vedanta, anarchism, socialism, pan-Islamism, Asianism, etc., the liberation of their native land, which would enable them to work for the emancipation of the entire human race. In this way, we can conclude that the revolutionary movement had a rich intellectual tradition even before the rise of its celebrated ideologue Bhagat Singh, who was himself a product of its 3-decade-old history. The Bengal-centric studies on the movement, which restrict it to Hindu revivalism and physical culture, need to be revised to get a more wholesome picture of revolutionary ideas as they struggled with international political currents and local development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prabal. An enormous amount of material you just covered there. I will now go straight to our discussant, who will pull together some of the threads of this very rich discussion of the past hour and a half. Dr. Mukherjee, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor MacLean. I'm told by Rohit that you might have other engagements. Do you want to come before me, or is it take on right now? I mean, I'm absolutely open to both. If you want, you can. Yeah.
How long do you think we'll go for? Because I can stay a little over, but not greatly over.
So why don't you give your comments first, and then I can take on from there. Great.
Okay, so I really welcome this discussion. I think there's a lot of exciting promise in trying to uncover these intellectual histories of people who have been peripheral to what has become a settled nationalist historiography. And so I think it's a wonderful thing that this historiography is now being troweled over, and new perspectives by trying to complicate the landscape that we have, inherited for so many decades now, by introducing, by shining new light on characters that have been held in the wings of the larger histories of anti-colonialism that we're trying to come to terms with. And I think the biographical approach is a very rich one. And I think biographies in particular are rich because ideas themselves and intellectual histories are so dynamic that I really think it's only within the context of biography that we can understand the contextual pressures on individuals that help us to understand why, for example, Kripalani, for example, is so difficult to actually locate in any one political position. And likewise, as Surbhi explained so nicely in her paper, it's trying to locate any of these actors, in fact, on a stable political spectrum is so extremely difficult. And I don't think, in part, that's because the political spectrum through which we inherit through Western political tradition is obviously a foreign one. And therefore, it becomes so much more complicated and dynamic because we're dealing, of course, with Indian actors. What I found really interesting is that the problematic that people come back to again and again is that of religion. And despite so much thinking outside of, so many different frameworks, it's the religious framework that seems to come back and which is a recurrent theme in all of the political actors that we've talked about in the last hour and a half. And I guess my question then is, why is it that religion becomes the trope within which many political actors revert to? So I guess that's a question that perhaps all of the speakers might like to try and address. Not all of the political actors, of course, do get stuck with religion, but it seems to be certainly a recurrent one. So I think that was a theme that came up again and again. The other question that I have is, if we're looking through the prism of biography, when do we regard someone's ideological attainment to have settled? And again, I've found this very interesting, in particular with the many biographies of Gandhi that crop up. I find it very hard actually to talk about Gandhian thought in any kind of fixed fashion, because it is so dynamic and flexible and contextual. And so I find it, I think again, this is why the biographical approach is really important, because there are so many factors to consider when trying to come to an understanding of a person's ideological arrival, perhaps. And in particular, I think this came out very nicely with Devika's paper on Kripalani, but also with regard to Chittaranjan Das perhaps as well, and certainly all of the revolutionaries that were discussed. So I think that was also a common theme with all of the papers. I might then, with those broad comments, come back to you, Dr. Mukherjee. I'm sure you can make better sense than I do.
Absolutely. I'm not sure of that, but I will try my best. I really wanted to be better prepared than I am. Because of the paucity of time, I could not really write out a response. I would try and pick up a few threads from the 4 papers. But before that, I'll make some comments, because Rohit asked me to talk for about 15-20 minutes, though I would try to keep it much shorter than that, and maybe open up the floor for discussion. Because this is a workshop format, it might actually be a good idea for more webcams to be on as well. But of course, it is entirely optional. So, I would like to begin with the first paper itself, Devika's paper, where she starts with this this lament really from Rudrangshu Mukherjee that in contrast to the West, in India we do not have a culture of writing biographies, of political biographies. At one level, I take the point, but I'm not particularly convinced of the argument for some specific reasons, because I think that the emergence of Indian historiography from the 50s and the 60s did involve a fair amount of focus on individuals. It is a bit strange today to actually imagine that, most of the most important historians in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they were actually looking at pre-colonial period, right? It is only in the 60s and 70s that you have modern history coming up. And you have a lot of focus there, in towards historical characters, from Ashoka to Aurangzeb to Shivaji to Siraj-ud-Dawla and so on and so forth. So there is a considerable amount of focus on personalities. Biography in the modern sense, perhaps not, but definitely there is some amount of attention given to individuals. Even the first generation of modern historians were not completely neglecting biographies. I'm particularly reminded of Sarvepalli Gopal, right, and his 3-volume excellent biography of Jawaharlal Nehru, and even better biography of his own father, Radhakrishnan, and so on. But it is true that over time, that focus on biography, on personalities actually dwindle. I think for two pretty commonly known reasons. One is that of a critique of individual-centric, especially great men histories that crop up. And by the 1950s, 60s already, it is it is not in fashion anymore. There is a move to say economic history, social history, and that kind of thing. And that, of course, brings with it, various kinds of historiographical shifts as well, particularly the shift to a Marxian framework, even what some scholars call the nationalist Marxist consensus, right? So even even scholars like Bipin Chandra and so on, there is a sort of affinity towards Marxian frames of understanding Indian history, and therefore, the focus moves from individuals to that of processes, to that of movements. Most importantly, especially with the emergence of Marxism as probably the most important intellectual force since about, from the 60s onwards, definitely. And in the 70s and 80s, you have the subaltern studies movement, which basically takes Indian historiography to a very, very different direction. Though I think the concern about, how people think is not entirely absent. It might be important for us to keep in mind that there were some amount of intellectual history that was still being written by political scientists. Some of them, were part of the subaltern studies school itself. I'm thinking of, say, biographies of Bankim by Sudipto Kaviraj, or, of Bankim, Jawaharlal Nehru, Gandhi, and so on. Is coming back over and over again in Partha Chatterjee's writings, nationalist thought in the colonial world and that kind of thing. So it's not that individuals completely drop out. Even in subaltern studies, I think the attempt to recover, the consciousness of peasant consciousness or subaltern consciousness is an effort to recover thought in some ways. Not canonical figures, not major political figures, not personalities perhaps, but there is a concern about what people are thinking and how historical processes are shaped by thought. But of course, when it comes to subaltern groups and so on, you simply do not have the kind of material perhaps to have individuals and then build an intellectual history around those figures. So it's really not a history of thought, but a history of consciousness that lurks behind the subaltern studies movement as well. Now, I think the casualty in all of this is actually those intermediary figures, and that is why I think this panel is particularly valuable. The contributions that all the panelists have made are very, very important. Either you have a focus on those canonical figures, you look at collected works and write biographies and intellectual histories and so on and so forth, or there is an attempt to cull out processes of thought where adequate material does not exist. Here is a rich minefield, I think, of recovering thoughts and actions, because records do exist, of these figures. And actually that can really complicate our understanding of the unfolding of Indian history in the late colonial, early post-colonial period. I mean, anyone who has looked at the kind of treasure trove that you have in Timurti or National Archives would know that it is not impossible at all to write about what these figures were thinking. Now, again, I mean, let me also say that I don't think that these intermediary figures have not been talked about at all, but it has been talked about in frames which have been, I think, quite limiting. And that has been talked about in the frame of, say, a Cambridge school sort of model, where you have the locality, province, nation kind of model. So these actors then become intermediaries, negotiating between the masses who are to be mobilized and the high command, as it were, right? And it has been somewhat reductive as well, in the sense that either these figures have been studied as, through the axis of, say, a high command versus provincial leadership, so center-province sort of relationship between leaders, or as left and right divides, right? So who is on the left? So, because the focus has been on factions and that kind of thing, you have either these figures being studied either as the provincial bosses, negotiating with the high command, that kind of faction, or, a left wing and a right wing faction in some sort of way. But of course, within the scope of Cambridge School, that kind of stability of ideology is not something that is recognized very much either, right? So basically you have political ambitions, limits of existing historical circumstances that lead to various kinds of shifting political alliances. But broadly, these are seen as leaders leading factions, and thereby, contributing enormously to Indian politics. I think, some of these studies are very, very valuable, and I'm not saying for a moment, that it has not been valuable at all. But I think the frames have often been limiting, and it is only in the recent past that you have serious intellectual histories that are being written by historians. But then the focus again is on canonical figures. I think that has been a problem. Recently, a lot of good work has come out on, say, Gandhi, on Jinnah, on Nehru, and so on. But I think, again, there is a tendency to fall back upon a certain kind of great men histories. Now, when it comes to projects of this kind that we are discussing today, regional figures and so on, I think it has great potential, great importance. Often when we are doing our PhDs or early career work and that kind of thing, feasibility of the project is also very important. And I think these projects are entirely feasible to do, because there is quite a considerable amount of material, actually, if one really looks for them at the right places. There are two cautionary notes that I would like to sound at this point itself. Is that one is that one needs to be careful when one talks about these sort of somewhat marginal figures. We should not, I think, fall into the trap of what is called the search for a tragic hero, and sometimes it does happen a bit. They are studied because there is a sense that they have been wrongfully marginalized, and therefore, there is a tendency to resurrect them as important figures, probably, canonical figures as well, who have been left out of history in some ways, and tragic because they have been neglected, they have been marginalized, they have not been studied enough, and also because perhaps their projects never really were fulfilled. That is, I think, a very important consideration that we need to keep in mind when we are dealing with these figures, because it is very easy to fall into these traps. I mean, even when we are critical, at the end of it, what we are coming up with is the idea that here is a great man who has been neglected, right? So that is the kind of trope I think we need to avoid, and therefore keep that in mind. The second is it's not about this panel, but I think this is a problem of writing about these political actors all across the table, is basically the gross neglect of women characters. It cannot just be overemphasized. I don't think, other than Indira Gandhi, there is a single woman politician in India on whom you have competent work written by historians. I don't mean, there are biographies written by all kinds of people. There are party functionaries who write biographies of their leaders, right? Then there are also more journalistic ways of looking at figures. But when it comes to serious historical study, I think there is an utter neglect of women actors. We don't even have good historical biographies written by serious academic historians on even the key figures. We don't have one on, say, Sarojini Naidu, or or even for that matter, Sucheta Kripalani, right? Though we have a paper on Acharya Kripalani, but that Sucheta Kripalani does not figure in that story. So these are, I think, that is something that we also need to keep in mind. Of course, there are. When you discuss these male figures, you talk about their idea of women, their idea of sexuality and that kind of thing. But women themselves do not figure very much in these stories. And that leads me to some specific comments about Devika's paper. It's a fascinating paper with some very important historical correctives. However, there are a few issues that I would like you to clarify, if possible, which is basically, we talk about. So you basically get Kripalani and explore his relationship with, say, Gandhi, Nehru, and those figures. But I'm wondering if it might be productive to also think about some of the other figures who come into your story in not a very prominent way, perhaps, but I think they have great potential. One is that of Tandon, right? Purushottam Das Tandon comes up in your story. They are friends, you say, but also we know that they contested elections against each other, in the Congress party. And therefore, it couldn't have been a very smooth relationship. And that probably will bring out
Sir, can I speak for a minute? These are two different people. So there's P.D. Tandon, who was also a journalist, and Purushottam Das Tandon, who was also like the person who contested against him.
Okay. But in any case, Purushottam Das Tandon, the Congress leader, for example, would be an interesting personality to study alongside alongside Kripalani, for example. Patel, is again a figure that would be interesting to study. His relationship with, various other kinds of oppositional political parties, especially the Jana Sangh, I think, if it can be worked out, it can actually give you a much more nuanced sort of understanding. Swatantra Party and so on. These opposition parties that are coming up, what is his relationship? Of course, you hint at them, but if you could elaborate slightly more. I was particularly fascinated with this idea that you talk about, which is basically the idea of socialism as anti-communism. So he's a socialist, but he's vehemently against communism and and Marxism. What are the the nuances of that kind of idea? Yeah. When it comes to, thank you very much. It was a great paper. I really enjoyed reading it. Surbhi's paper, I was, it's again a very, very interesting paper, and it really, complicates our understanding of this national language issue in very, very fundamental ways. Because, by reading any kind of textbook, one gets the idea that, there were two kinds of people, right? One kind who were Hindi fanatics, and usually they are associated with, say, right-wing sort of ideas and so on, who basically want to impose Hindi, and they have no consideration for anybody else, somewhat villainous characters. And then you have resistance to that from the South and so on, DMK, who basically see this as completely non-negotiable. But it really opens up the space for looking at various kinds of ways in which the language question was negotiated. And this is something that I found very, very interesting. Also, when it comes to language, I particularly found it interesting how, Lohia is primarily targeting English language, so his problem is with European language, not hegemony of European thought, which is how we think today, right? In the academia and so on, that actually we say that, the language is not the problem. The problem is the dominance of European thought. And even when we write in the vernacular, we replicate European thought. But the concerns seem to be very, very different. I was particularly interested if you could, I was wondering actually if it might be a good idea to separate out, to actually, this contradiction that you highlight is very interesting. One is that, he basically sees Gandhi as a symbol of Indian unity, right? He basically does not like people going and, burning his portrait or whatever. But again, there is this Brahmin Baniya domination rhetoric that comes up. And then there is a veneration for Ambedkar, who basically Ambedkar and Gandhi have this particular relationship. There is a certain kind of veneration with which he talks to Ambedkar that you highlight. So if those contradictions could be stated out in a slightly more forceful fashion, foregrounded, I think there might be more complex pictures that might emerge. Yeah. So it's more of a comment rather than a question, really. When now I will not take more time at all. I will very, very quickly wrap up. Tania, C.R. Das again is definitely a figure that needs to be studied. It's a very, very important work, I think. I was wondering if you have seen Rajat Ray's work, Local Roots of Indian Nationalism, because there is a lot of, there is some discussion on the importance of the Calcutta Corporation. Calcutta Corporation being probably the most, the richest sort of local body, right, in India at that time. I was wondering if some of the things that you highlight may be complicated a bit. From your story, it seems that the Calcutta Corporation's effort was primarily welfareist, right? That there were certain kinds of educational policies, health policies, and so on. That is what the corporation was thinking. But the corporation in Calcutta was also the major funding agency for Gandhi movements, right? The non-cooperation movement in Bengal is pretty much funded by the Calcutta Corporation under C.R. Das's leadership and so on. So it's not just welfareist, but also, these organizations are being captured by nationalist figures who are then, doing all sorts of things with their hold over the corporation. When it comes to the idea of the one thing about C.R. Das I would want you to comment more on is basically the communal question, because you do highlight this idea of Doridra Narayan and so on. After all, the Doridra has to be a Narayan, right? So it is again a sort of within a Hindu worldview, it is revolving around, and that relates directly to Professor MacLean's question. Actually, in the 1920s in Calcutta, the most important question around the city is the communal polarization, which is becoming more and more important. And C.R. Das is seen as this one person who really attempted to sort it out, the famous Hindu-Muslim pact that he actually worked out. Now, of course, and it falls through, the moment he dies in 1925, that pact is absolutely thrown to the wind. And that has huge repercussions later on. So some of these questions, when it comes to, I'm also slightly, I'm wondering what is the appropriateness of using the word citizen, in the 1920s context, when you say that, citizens into nationals and so on. So what is the idea of citizenship that he's working with, for example, if some of these things you could clarify a little. And when it comes to Prabal's paper, I think it is a very, very important paper. I completely agree with you that the idea of revolutionary sort of revolutionary thought, revolutionary movement has been terribly Bengal centric and also perhaps Punjab centric, right? With the complete neglect of other places, and UP will be a very, very fertile space to actually dig for recovering these histories. In the paper, I see that there is an entire section on the United Provinces, but in your presentation, you perhaps missed out a bit on that. If you could, locate this discussion around these figures more in the context of UP, and who were the actors in UP, beyond Bismil, whom you mentioned. Who are the other revolutionary figures, really? Are there any women figures, for example? In Bengal, you do have women figures, in the revolutionary movement. What is the caste? You say that, that he's really concerned about caste and gender. Are there actually some lower caste figures in the revolutionary movement? I would like to know. In Bengal, for example, you will be pressed really hard to find one, right? But we really know very little about the UP situation. It would be great if you could comment on that. So I will end here, and then if you want to respond, and then or maybe the floor can be thrown open. Professor MacLean can decide what to do now. Thank you.
I feel like all of the speakers should perhaps respond as briefly as possible. So could we perhaps allocate 5 minutes to a response from each speaker? Would that be possible? Could we start with you, Devika?
So the main reason why my paper actually does not have any timeline, Professor, was because I feel that, as you said, you cannot have this one moment where you can say a person's ideology came into being. That's why I just took up the whole life. I think you cannot, compartmentalize a person's life into phases when, you're talking about him. So that's why the paper as such did not follow any kind of timeline. I wanted to show how his viewpoints changed. And Professor Mukherjee, you mentioned about Kripalani and socialism, right? And how he was a socialist and how he could still critique Marxism. In that sense, he was, I just said, he was a socialist only on the surface. He never really reconciled himself to being with the socialists. That's why he eventually, had to leave the party. It was more on the lines of just coming together and opposing the Congress. For him, ideology did not play any role. So he was always opposed to Marxism. If you read his books, even before independence, that is one thing that comes very, very much properly, that he was never in favor of Marxism or even communism. And he was actually very, very anti-communist throughout, his political career, especially after independence. So that is there. And so you mentioned about women figures. So I have not mentioned this part because this presentation was about to be only for 20 minutes. But in my PhD dissertation, which is the biography of Kripalani, I do intend to write about Sucheta Kripalani, because it was very interesting in their part, because she was also a politician in her own right. She was the first woman to become the chief minister of a state. So yeah, I do intend to look at it, but it will be looked at it in a much detailed way in my dissertation. So yes, does anybody else have a question, specific question? I would be happy to answer it.
Perhaps if from now we can go straight to Surbhi.
So I can see that Rohit has posted a question. Okay, I'll first begin with the comment that had been offered by Professor Mukherjee, which was about, am I audible? I'm audible, right? Yeah, which Professor Mukherjee had mentioned about foregrounding the relationship or the kind of engagements and conversations that Lohia had with Gandhi, with Periyar, and with Ambedkar, and how they were different, or how these engagements further complicate the story of Ram Manohar Lohia. It was simply for the lack of time that I did not really go into the details of these engagements, as I have mentioned in the paper. I will quickly give a brief of these engagements, if that's all right. So, as far as Jawaharlal Nehru is concerned, also there's a reason why I picked up these four figures. This again has to do with the categorization that I draw from Gopal Guru's essay, where Gandhi is categorized in under the term Desi, Nehru under the term derivative, and Periyar and Ambedkar under the term beyond. Now, going to what kind of relationships Lohia shared with these three different sets of people, or the three different kinds of imaginations of a post-independence nation that they represented. As far as Nehru goes, the relationship is very, very clearly acrimonious, caustic, very hateful. I think the worst in Lohia comes out when he's either trying to chastise Nehru or trying to pick a bone of contention with him. So I think that is one area which is quite clear, and I do not think it can be complicated too much. As far as Gandhi's figure goes, now that's an interesting arena. I think it would also be interesting to draw in Jayaprakash Narayan in order to understand how Lohia thought of Gandhi and Gandhian ideas and ideals. So there is a debate, and there has been a debate in order to understand what exactly it was that kind of separated Lohia and Jayaprakash Narayan beyond a point in their understandings or conceptualizations of how socialism should have played out in the Indian context. And I think one major distinction here turns out to be how much these two were going to lean towards or away from the Gandhian ideals of trusteeship, of self-sufficient villages, etc., etc. Because these are ideals that towards the end of his political career, JP really veered towards. The entire idea of Sarvodaya was something that moved away from a very materialistic idea of a socialist change. The fast that he underwent in 1952, and then he came out of it saying that it was some kind of a rebirth. His association further with the Bhudan movement, etc., took him closer and closer to Gandhian ideals, and that is how he also framed his idea of socialism in the later part of his career, which was the path that Lohia did not take absolutely at all. Lohia stuck with a very materialistic understanding of how socialism should have played out, and how caste and class inequalities needed to be uprooted from the Indian society. So as far as Gandhi goes, Lohia does have a certain kind of reverence that he bestows upon Gandhi, but at the same time, he has some very, very strong disagreements. As far as the language question itself goes, Lohia does seem to be influenced by Gandhi, however. Even in the kind of terminologies that he uses. For instance, Lohia continuously throughout his political career stuck to the use of the word Harijan. even in his correspondences with Dr. Ambedkar, which happens over the years of 1955 and 56, while Ambedkar does not use the word Harijan, Lohia quite openly, even in those letters to Dr. Ambedkar, does. So there is a certain Gandhian influence that he carries throughout his political career, but there are also certain differences that he made very clear as far as Gandhi went. Now, the two meetings that I was more intrigued by, or rather the two correspondences that I was more intrigued by, were with Periyar and with Ambedkar. Interestingly, also, so with Periyar, it was a jail meeting. While Periyar had been jailed for for inciting violence against Brahmins and for inciting his followers to go ahead and break the sacred thread of some of the Brahmins and burn the national flag and burn a portrait of Gandhi. What I felt was that Lohia Lohia really wanted to bond with Periyar over the issue of their common hatred towards Congress and Jawaharlal Nehru, under whose diktat Periyar had been sent to jail. But interestingly, there's a certain bit of their meeting that I found really interesting, which was that the moment Lohia reaches to meet Periyar, Periyar outright says that I do not understand Hindi and I do not speak English, so we are not going to converse in these two languages. And Lohia, he agrees, and Lohia is very humble, very he's almost reverential towards Periyar also. He says that, okay, we have a translator here, he's a friend and he's going to translate for us. So which is why I think that a person who is so staunch on using Hindi as the common language and Hindi as the other language for a bilingual setup could so easily give in to another person who is so anti-Hindi. And even in the reporting of this meeting that Lohia does later, like I mentioned in the presentation, he calls Periyar a rebel child of Mother India. So evidently, the language question itself does not become, or even the burning of a picture or portrait of Gandhi or of the national flag does not become an issue so big that Lohia would give up the common cause of either anti-Congressism or of the dismantling of the caste structure. In his However, this engagement with Periyar does not go on for too long. However, there was something that really irked me while I was going through this bit of reportage, which was that he never uses the word Periyar, despite the fact that Periyar does not want to be referred to as Mr. Naikar. It was a public avowal. Despite that, somehow Lohia sticks to calling him Mr. Naikar and does not refer to him as Periyar. But again, that's besides the point. As far as his correspondence with Dr. Ambedkar goes, it happened, like I said, over a period of 2 years, 1955 and 1956. And Lohia is almost requesting and groveling for an alliance with Ambedkar in these letters. They never ended up meeting. It was only an exchange of letters, but Lohia was more than keen on having an alliance with Ambedkar. He, even while talking to his associates like Madhu Limaye after Ambedkar passes away, in anticipation of a meeting with him, Lohia continues to say that had Ambedkar given up his bitterness and his anger, he could have been a formidable leader of the entire Indian people. And which is where I feel that Lohia, despite all of these very idealistic uh, imaginaries of the dismantling of the caste structure, of even giving up these little, Periyar called his discomforts inconsequential, and that's not something that Lohia even kind of countered or tried to challenge. So if he could give up some of these, and I'm really sorry I'm taking a lot of time, I'll quickly wrap this one up and then move on to the other question. I'm really sorry about this. I mean, all I could feel is that Lohia cannot, and I don't think we could even expect somebody like Lohia to really go beyond his location his caste location, his class location, and even his education. I mean, at the end of the day, all of these people, Jayaprakash Narayan, Ram Manohar Lohia, they studied in Berkeley, they studied in Germany. I do not think that this privilege would really allow them to kind of to really allow them to go beyond the limitations of location to completely agree with either Periyar or Ambedkar. So this was in short the oh, okay. Should I continue? So sorry.
I just need to leave in about really at 10 to. So, but it's such a fascinating and rich discussion. I didn't actually want to interrupt you. I just wanted to let you know that I wasn't going to be able to stay for very much longer. So Rohit, can I pass the chair over to you to continue the?
Sure. I'll do the needful. Thank you, Professor MacLean. I understand you're all time of a difficult schedule.
I'm really sorry. It's been a really rich discussion, and I would like to stay for more, and in particular to hear more about Siardash and also to hear Prabal's answer to his question. But I do have your paper, Prabal, which I'm halfway through, and I look forward to reading and hearing more of these people and of your work. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for inviting me through.
Thank you for that.
Sorry to interrupt, Surbhi.
Yeah, I'll quickly move on to the question that Rohit has posted. So when I started trying to understand Lohia in his historical context, the impetus was actually to understand later and present day OBC politics or Shudra politics, for that matter, in Kanchailaya's terms. But as far as how they have carried on his politics, if there have been distinctions, I think the distinctions came in quite early with the moving away of, say, somebody like BP Mandal in Bihar and the formation of the Soshit Dal, and then further BP Mandal going on to become the chief minister of Bihar, and somehow Lohia's politics and his team of people getting sidelined because of I mean, this is not my argument. This is obviously Christopher Jaffelot's argument. But with the coming up of the Yadav community in this region, UP and Bihar, and the way there were fractures that had already started taking place, right? I mean, even when Lohia was still alive, I think there have been variations and a lot of fractures ever since. As far as I mean, even as far as, say, somebody like Karpuri Thakur or the lineage that, say, Lalu Prasad Yadav would trace from therein, there have been multiple changes. One would be the language question. I think once again the point is that these leaders of the later period actually come from communities which Ram Manohar Lohia did not come from. And I think this is the reason, this is the primary reason why we see this new kind of metaphor or a new language being now devised by Lalu Prasad Yadav, a very new mode of communication. Bhojpuri is being used, a new kind of humor is being used publicly. There's a new kind of democratization, so to say, if I could use the term. So I do think that a lot of changes did come about in the later period, and I would say much needed changes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Surbhi. Maybe Tania can now respond.
Yeah, I do understand that we are way past the time, so I will be as brief as possible. As for the religious framework is concerned, when Siatas was kind of propagating his idea of Doritra Narayan, I think he was talking more about political accountability. I mean, he was presenting this idea of political accountability in this religious mythological trope. He was saying like that the Calcutta Corporation should be accountable uh, to the citizens of Calcutta, not to the provincial government, not to the central government, not to the home office in London, but to the people of the city. So I think he was uh, uh, bringing forth this idea of political accountability with this idea of seva or service. Towards the citizen, which brings us to the question of citizenship. What does citizenship mean in the 1920s? I think when the Calcutta Corporation or even C.R. Das or the members of the Calcutta Corporation were talking about citizenship, they were talking about like this individual who can be productive, and like basically they are talking about a citizen in the making. The nation was in the making as well, and also the citizen was in the process of making. So it was basically an individual who can be productive enough so as to contribute to this nation that is in the process of making. And this is quite interesting, which kind of brings us to this question of communal polarization. I mean, it is true that by late 1920s we can see communal polarization in Calcutta, especially in the areas of Bada Bazar, when you can have when you where you are having like these Hindu and Muslim communal conflicts, especially between the Hindu Marwaris and the Muslims who were living in the Bada Bazar area. And during that time, you can actually see that the Marwaris, they are going to the police and demanding police protection on the account that they are the more productive citizens of the city, that they are contributing more economically. So somehow they deserve more protection than their Muslim counterparts. Uh, so yes, I mean, the history of Calcutta Corporation and the history of Calcutta in the interwar years is immensely complicated. But this is how I would kind of see the ideas of citizenship and communal polarization in the interwar years. Uh, I hope that kind of answers the questions a little bit.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tanya.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Prabal?
Yeah, thank you, sir. First of all, I'm extremely sorry I couldn't read out my section which dealt specifically with UP because of paucity of time. But the five figures which I talked about, two of them, they were very prominent leaders of the movement in UP. Shochindranath Sanyal, although he was a Bengali, but he was a resident of Banaras. And of course, Ram Prasad Bismil, who led the movement in the Terai belt in the North UP. So, and Bhagat Singh, even Bhagat Singh is remembered as a Punjabi revolutionary, but most of his revolutionary career he spent in Kanpur in UP. So this fact also needs to be like taken into account. So in my doctoral thesis, I'm focusing on UP. So I'm talking about figures like Sundar Lal, whom the Rowlatt Committee has called the first leader of revolutionary movement in UP. I have people like Gendalal Dikshit, who led the movement during the First World War. Then there are women revolutionaries, Durga Devi Vora, Sushila Mohan. There are Muslims like Ashfaqullah Khan, whom usually we don't associate with this entire Hindu revivalist understanding of revolutionary movement. Then, of course, Chandrasekhar Azad, who's a popular figure but has not been analyzed by any historian till now. Jogesh Chatterjee, another Bengali who made Kanpur the base of his politics. Yashpal, Jharkhande Rai, Satya Bhakt, Radha Mohan Gokul. So these are some of the figures which I am working on in my doctoral research. And you are entirely right that UP is a very important field and completely unexplored and untouched by academicians. Another important question which Professor Mukherjee raised was that of caste. Interestingly, the Gadar party which I talked about, majority of Gadar party activists are agricultural laborers like Baba Prithvi Singh Azad, Udham Singh. So it's a very interesting organization, and there are some good works on it like Maya Ramnath, Harish Puri. But I'm trying to see Gadar party's activities in UP specifically, because there is this Banaras conspiracy case which was associated with Gadar party. So again, like Bhagat Singh, we associate Gadar party with Punjab only, but Gadar party has a different history in UP also. So yes, oppressed caste has a representation in the revolutionary movement. Then there is one organization which I have not talked about in this paper, but I have one chapter on it in my doctoral thesis. That is on Matrivedi. It was a group active in UP, especially in the Chambal region. So in South UP during the First World War, this group recruited bandits from the Chambal Valley who belonged to backward caste, who belonged to the oppressed caste. So it's a very interesting thing, and it's very surprising that this organization has never been studied by any scholar till now, despite the fact that it had so much influence on the revolutionaries in 20s and 30s, like people on Bhagat Singh, Ramprasad Bismil. This group was very influential. And then there is one person, Karodi Lal, who's from Kanpur, and he sings for the group. He's a part of the cultural troupe of this group, and he belongs to the caste of Notankis, like people who traditionally sang songs in villages. So he comes from a very marginalized section. Then in my PhD, again, I have talked about more such people like Babbar Ram, Balrup Sharma. They belong to very backward caste of Eastern UP, but went on to become very important revolutionary leaders. And in post-colonial India, very important communist leaders. Women, I mentioned Durga Devi Vora, Sushila Mohan, Prakashwati Pal. There are a number of women who got engaged in actions, like their counterparts in Bengal, Pritilata and others. We know Durga Bhabi, as she was called, helped Bhagat Singh escape from Lahore, but we never see any mention that how Durga Bhabi, she planned the attack on governor of Punjab when he visited Bombay, which is known as Bombay shooting case. So this entire judicial record, it has never been explored by any scholar. But when I was talking about caste and women, marginalized sections of Indian society, but my important point is the class background of these revolutionaries. So in the beginning, we see like people from old landed elite like Aurobindo, Hardyal. But interestingly, from the 1920s, after non-cooperation movement and large-scale politicization of Indian population, we see people coming from poor peasant background, from landless laborer background, who are becoming a part of revolutionary movement. There are people like Bhagat Singh who come from a middle peasant background. But then people like Chandrasekhar Azad, Ramprasad Bismil, Shatinath Sanyal, who come from a very poor peasant background, and some of them are even landless laborers. So this is an interesting shift in even the class composition of the revolutionary movement, which we can, I think, see from Ghadar movement, but after the non-cooperation movement, it becomes more important. Then again, if you talk about these marginalized people, then apart from Dalits, if you are talking about 1920s and 1930s, backward castes like Kurmis, like Ahirs, that is Yadavs, they are also very important. Like most of them, they are poor peasants, okay, and or marginal peasants, and they are facing this zamindari oppression. They are facing talukdars and whatnot in like in UP, like completely feudal era landed elite, and they're fighting against their oppression, their exploitation, against number of arbitrary taxes, against begar. So one, in peasant movement, we see a unity of these backward castes and Dalits in 20s and 30s. Also in the revolutionary movement, we see a representation of people coming from backward castes. And then, of course, there is Madari Pasi, on whom I'm trying to work for my postdoc thing. Madari Pasi is a very interesting figure from Awadh, central UP, who belongs to the Dalit caste of Pasi, but he emerges as an important leader of the peasant movement in 1920s. He defies Gandhi, he defies Baba Ramchandra, and then he joins hands with Bhagat Singh, which is a completely unknown chapter of our history of 20s and 30s. He joined hands with Bhagat Singh, and Pasis, they went on to play a role in underground revolutionary movement right up to the Naxalite movement in 60s, 70s. These Pasis, they remain a militant group, and they participate in the Naxalite movement, which again interestingly had many leaders from the anti-colonial revolutionary movement. So if you people must have like noticed the title of my PhD thesis. I'm trying to trace this journey from 1930 to 2007, because revolutionaries.
Really
Yeah,
interesting.
thank you. Thanks a lot. Because
we
for
really
revolutionaries, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So to conclude, I would say that for revolutionaries, colonial and post-colonial, that was not always true. Like many of them, they did not accept 1947 as freedom. Most of them. So it's very interesting the divisions we create between colonial and post-colonial. For many people, this was not true. There was a continuation of their struggle. So many of them went on to lead the Naxalite movement. So this is a kind of alternative history of the revolutionary movement, which I am trying to write. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Razak, would you like to ask the question? Switch. Is he there? I think he's left. So Razak had a question that he wanted to ask. He says, I have a general question to the panelist about intellectual biography and question of archive. What are the ways in which we can write intersubjective biographies, including wife, uh, friends? Uh, sorry, is Razak there? Rohit?
Left. I think Ole has a question to ask. He's written it down, but
There.
you can actually
Right.
switch off the mic.
Maybe
Because
Ole
we
can.
take another question.
Yeah. We also need to hurry up.
Ole, would
Probably.
you like to ask the question?
Yeah.
I know you put it out. Would you want to ask it?
Should I? I mean, I can ask. I mean, I've written it out in the chat, but it was particularly to Prabal about Lala Harial, whose sort of anti-colonial activities and intellectual output was quite limited, actually, from about 1909 to 1914, and then he enters the First World War, and he's involved in the Indian Independence Committee, and then sort of drops out basically in 1915 or 16, and retreats to Sweden in 1917, and really never returns to the sort of Indian anti-colonial movement. So I do wonder if there's, I mean, because it's such a short span of time, and certainly also his. I mean, I know you talk about his sort of engagement with anarchism, which is intriguing, and Maya Ramnath has done a great work. But he never really wrote in sort of anarchist periodicals from the time. He knew Alexander Berkman and Emmy Goldman and a few other anarchists in California. And also, I mean, I've been doing a bit of work on sort of the Indian Independence Committee in the First World War, and some of his peers talk about his dictatorial behavior, and contrast that actually with his sort of talk about anarchism, and also his anti-Muslim sentiments were apparently well known already when he was at India House, sort of in 1907, 8, 9. And it's something that Bhupendra Datta talked about being widely known. So I wonder if we need to read some of these sort of problems, biographical problems, into his intellectual output as well.
Can I respond? Yeah, I will try to be as brief as possible. Well, I agree with Ole that the revolutionary career of Lala Hardayal maybe was not very long, but my point is the intellectual impact which these figures had on the revolutionary movement and the anti-colonial struggles. So if you read the writings of those times, 20s, 30s, Lala Hardayal was a very, very important figure. Like for most revolutionaries, Bhagat Singh, Ram Prasad Bismil, Chatinath Sanyal, they keep on mentioning about Hardayal, that how Hardayal was the dominating figure in the revolutionary movement before Bhagat Singh. It's only Bhagat Singh who gets a larger kind of popularity across India, as noted by intelligence reports, Nehru, etc. But before that, at least amongst the intelligentsia, Lala Hardayal represented the Indian revolutionary movement, perhaps after Aurobindo, because he took retirement from politics. And then the different stands in the ideology of Lala Hardayal, because he went on to live till 33, although not directly engaged in anti-colonial struggles, but he was a prolific writer. And it is his writings which I think are more important than his activities. His activities did had a role to play in First World War, but it is his writings which afterwards, which are published in modern review, like he is considered the first person who wrote on Marx, and he called him a modern rishi. So the influence of his writings, which are there on the revolutionary movement, it continues till 1947, and that's very interesting. When Bhagat Singh and others decide to become Marxists, they trace it to Lala Hardayal. They say that he was the man who first introduced us to Marxism. And then, yes, there are varieties of issues on which he is writing, and he is changing his views. And I have dealt with that in my paper, but I couldn't say it here. Emily Brown has also raised these kind of questions which Ole you are raising. But this is what I think other papers also pointed out, that this left-right dichotomy, that's not very, useful for 20s, 30s, or, during the First World War and that time. Because ultimately, everything is of this is a part of modern politics. Religion, class, gender, nation, class. Maybe today we think of religion as a regressive thing, regressive politics. But at that time, Hinduism, Vedanta, all these things, they were very much a part of modern politics. Like they were constituted at that time. Maybe they trace their legacy to a golden age or ancient period, medieval period, but ultimately they were modern creations. They were constructed in the 20th century. And while some chose to continue with what Orientalist scholars or colonial scholars did, but many tried to subvert it. And I place revolutionary movement as an attempt which was there to subvert these kind of colonial constructions into their own radical program. So Lala Hardayal is one of that kind of figures. So just because he later on develops a kind of understanding of Hinduism as important does not make him anti-revolutionary and non-revolutionary figure. So these changes in his ideological understandings are important, but then there is one consistency of a radical reimagination of India from a colony to what he calls Federal Republic of United States of India. So this is how I think pro-Hindu notions of people like Hardayal, even Bismil and Sanyal, and then completely pro-atheistic or secular notions of Bhagat Singh needs to be understood in the context of 1910s, 20s, and 30s. I hope this answers Ole's question a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabal. I was wondering if there is anyone present over here who would like to ask a question? Or else we can conclude with Razak's question.
I think Razak asked question, unless there's somebody else who would like to ask.
Okay. Surbhi, there is, I think, a specific question for you. He says, could you speak about Lohia's thought and observation about Germany and Germans? I believe he studied there. He might be critical of English, but not necessarily all European languages.
Lohia did study in Berlin, but that's one chapter of his life that he never comments upon. It's almost like a blank spot. He does not comment on his university life. He does not comment on his life in Germany much, which is again unlike somebody like Jayaprakash Narayan. And that's something that people have wondered about. But there's nothing in specific that he says, as far as my reading of his later writings also goes, about Germany or the German people or the German language in specific. So yeah, I think that's pretty much that. And as far as the question of other European languages goes, he really isn't as much concerned about it. Like I said, he does call upon French at one point to say that at one point in time French was the language of civilization. Now it's English. It's a general process of historicization. Wherein he envisages that English is also going to decline, where he really brings up the question of other languages. But otherwise, there really isn't much that he kind of says specifically about Germany or the German language or the German people.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for this very stimulating discussion and a series of very stimulating papers. I will ask Rohit to make the concluding comments because we don't have the chair with us right now.
Yeah, so I won't take much time. I'm really happy this was such an engaging conversation all around. Thank you to all the presenters and those who've joined pretty late in Indian time, joined to listen into this. We still have a day of workshop left tomorrow, 2 wonderful panels tomorrow, so do join in. And yeah, thank you wherever you are. Good night, good evening. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Mukherjee and all the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you.